Chapter 536. The fire Qilin also paused. It had used 30% of its strength just now. Why couldn't it get rid of him with 30% of its strength? What was going on? The fire Qilin subconsciously looked at Beligaju. Master. Beligaju raised his hand, indicating that it didn't need to say anything. The little one reached out and tied the fire Qilin to the side. Then he carried the dried fruit over. He tilted his head and thought for a while. Then he leaned over and bit the fire Qilin. The fire Qilin suddenly moved. Its eyes darkened even more. It immediately turned around and began to communicate with Beligaju. Master, I felt pain just now. Logically speaking, even a spirit beast wouldn't make me feel pain, let alone a human. Everyone knew that the Qilin's skin was thick and invulnerable. However, the little one in front of him could hurt it. This was not normal. It doesn't taste good. The little one spat out. Hellion Vivian walked over and said with a wicked smile, it won't taste good if you eat it raw. You need to add seasoning. Make it for me, third sister-in-law. After the little one finished speaking, he hugged Beligage's leg. Third brother, lend third sister-in-law to me for a while. I want to eat Qilin meat. Beligage glanced at him and said in a calm voice, eat a mouthful of Qilin meat and dance for a day. You decide whether to eat it or not. When the little one heard the word dance, his little hands instinctively covered his pants. He shook his head like a rattledrum. Third brother, you can't always make me dance. That's not right. Do you want to eat it or not? Beligaju didn't even listen to him. He reached out and picked the little one up. The little one was anxious. His little legs swayed back and forth. He pouted and didn't say anything. Beligaju raised him until they were at eye level. He said calmly, if you don't eat the fire Qilin, I'll give you 10 more meat buns. I want to eat 20. 10 is too little. The little one's eyes lit up again. Beligaju smiled. You want to negotiate? Forget it, you should just dance. 15. The little one pouted. Third brother, I can't go any lower. Beligaju turned around and ordered Eunuch's son, go get him 15 meat buns. Yes. Eunuch's son looked at the sky silently. If he had known that the meat bun would be able to solve the problem, why would he have waited here for so long? However, the little one felt that he had profited. He counted with his small hands and said, Third brother, 15 meat buns. I can eat 3 meat buns a day for 5 days. I just bit into the fire Qilin's meat, and it doesn't taste good at all. Fire Qilin, how dare he despise it? There's nothing delicious about its hard skin, Beligaju said calmly. Fire Qilin was speechless. However, Beligaju lowered his eyes and continued, you have to remember that you can't eat my food. Hearing these words, the retired emperor was somewhat gratified. This was how the child should be educated. The little one frowned. What about imperial grandfather's food? Up to you. Beligaju gave the little one 2 words and left with the fire Qilin and the others. The retired emperor's roar could be heard faintly. Don't stop me. I'm going to teach those 2 a lesson today. Third sister-in-law, imperial grandfather's temper is getting worse. The little one took a bite of the meat bun. We're already so obedient, but he's still so grumpy. Hellion Vivian pinched his face. If you're really obedient, tell me how you dragged the fire Qilin here. With my hands. The little one puffed up his cheeks. Hellion Vivian wiped the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief. Little 7, you have to restrain your strength in the future, especially in front of outsiders. Do you understand? The little one paused and raised his eyes to look at his third brother. Beligaju nodded at him. I know. The little one had a domineering look on his face. I don't need to use my strength to beat them down. Third sister-in-law, tell me if anyone bullies you. Tell me if you want to eat fish. I've been practicing my fishing recently. I've already eaten all the fish in Eunuch's son's favorite pond. Hellion Vivian was silent. She thought that Eunuch's son didn't know about this. If he knew, he wouldn't have stopped the retired emperor. The fire Qilin stood behind the 2 of them. It retracted its gaze from the little one and looked into Beligaju's eyes. Master, I'm sure that the little 7th prince is not an ordinary human. who was born in the imperial family, is ordinaries? Beligaju turned the silver ring on his finger. In the flickering light, a trace of gold overflowed from his eyes. Arrange a few spirit beasts to follow Little Seven and protect him. The fire Qilin looked at its master's eyes, and its heart skipped a beat. Yes. Why is this happening? I haven't found all the soul fragments. Why is my master showing signs of demonization?
No.
I have to increase the search for the soul fragments as soon as possible. Otherwise, if the soul is not complete, my master will be demonized completely. If that's the case, no one can stop him. Go to the Chaoyang Palace. Beligaja's voice sounded again. The fire Qilin narrowed its eyes. Master, you noticed it too? Of course I noticed it. The smell of blood is so strong. Beligaju licked his thin lips with the tip of his tongue. There was a hint of evil on his face. Find it for me? Yes. At dusk, the sun was setting. Hellion Vivian was leisurely drinking tea with Little Seven when they saw two palace maids walking out of the Chaoyang Palace. They looked around as if they were afraid of something. They even looked back every 3 steps. Usually they wouldn't do this. After all, there were rules in the palace. How palace maids should walk and how they should greet their masters were all in accordance with the rules. But now, they seemed to be afraid of something and even forgot the rules. Eunuch Sunday, Hellion Vivian retracted her gaze and put the teacup on the table. What's wrong with those palace maids? Eunuch Sun poured her a cup of tea and lowered his voice. Princess Consort has been outside the palace for the past few days, so you don't know what's going on in the palace. I don't know what's going on in the palace, but there have been many palace maids dying in the palace. The way they died is very strange. Strange? Hellion Vivian's fingers paused. What's so strange? Eunuch Sun hesitated for a while before saying, someone drained their blood and threw them into the river. I don't know who did this. At first, the retired emperor didn't notice. After all, the palace is so big. No one would know if 2 or 3 palace maids died. Later, someone found 7 or 8 dried corpses by the river. This matter was revealed. But I don't know who the murderer is. The method is too cruel and evil. Today, the elders even told the retired emperor to invite some eminent monks to read scriptures. It's good to calm the people. Chapter 537. These elders are really interesting. So many people died, but what's the use of reading scriptures? Yuan Ming's mocking voice sounded. Hellion Vivian curled her lips. It's useless to the murderer, but it's useful to me, the possessor. Yuan Ming suddenly narrowed his eyes. It seems that we have the same idea. These eminent monks were most likely invited by those elders to deal with you. Hellion Vivian nodded. Holding the teacup, she leaned back and casually asked Eunuch Sun, the retired emperor should have agreed, right? He agreed. Eunuch Sun smiled. The elders said it in a justified manner, so there's nothing to decline. Princess Consort, you also know that those old officials, as long as they know their place, the retired emperor won't bother to say anything more to them. Hellion Vivian nodded. He should have agreed. If he didn't agree, it would make others think too much, and then the situation would be bad. The retired emperor asked this servant to inform Princess Consort. If you hear the Buddhist chanting, don't feel strange. It's said that they plan to chant for an entire day. I don't know if it has any effect. Eunuch Sun let out a long sigh. I've also seen those few little palace maids who died. It's a pity that they're all gone. Hellion Vivian's index finger rhythmically tapped the edge of the teacup. This was a movement she often did when she was thinking. Just now, Eunuch Sun said that the bodies were found by the river. I've been in the palace for so long, but I haven't seen a river in the palace. That area is remote. If you haven't been in the palace for a few years, you won't know. Eunuch Sun said this and looked to both sides. It's behind the cold palace. It's strange. It was originally just a small puddle of water that came in from the moat. I don't know what happened during this period, but the water level kept rising and became a river. If you ask this old servant, if the water level didn't rise, the situation wouldn't have been discovered so late. It's really a coincidence. Life and death are fated.
Sigh.
Hearing this, Hellion Vivian smiled meaningfully. It's really too much of a coincidence. Eunuch's son was a very astute person. He didn't know how to analyze the case, but he was still obedient. When he saw that Hellion Vivian's tone wasn't right, he raised an eyebrow. Does Wang Fei mean that there is something else going on? Hellion Vivian put down the teacup in her hand and said, Eunuch's son, do you still remember the mission the retired emperor gave us when His Highness and I went to Fuping? Yes. Eunuch's son hurriedly said, Fuping has a large area and is suitable for farming. However, due to the severe drought in the past 2 years, the harvest has been seriously affected. The retired emperor has been worried about Fuping recently. Fortunately, Princess Consort and His Highness went to Fuping this time and solved this problem. Hellion Vivian smiled casually and said, Fuping isn't the only dry place. Even the capital hasn't had any rain recently. It's related to the season. Eunuch's son, don't you think it's strange? Last month was the rainy season, but the small puddle you mentioned didn't rise much. This month, there hasn't been any rain for more than 10 days, but the puddle has risen. Don't you think it's strange? Eunuch's son was stunned. Then, he suddenly stood up straight and looked very excited. Princess Consort, Eunuch's Sunday. Before Eunuch's son could continue, Hellion Vivian interrupted him. Eunuch's son, just pretend that you didn't hear this. After all, if it wasn't because of the rain, it was very likely that there was a problem with the management of the moat. As for the flow of the moat, if it wasn't controlled by the higher-ups, no one would dare to make such a blatant change. Eunuch's son's fingers trembled slightly. This is not a trivial matter. Precisely because it's not a trivial matter, Hellion Vivian took a sip of tea and said, that's why Eunuch's son can't mention it. Eunuch's son glanced at Hellion Vivian and lowered his eyes, saying, this old servant understands. The moat was under the jurisdiction of the emperor's trusted subordinates. Even if the retired emperor's power was great, he was not in that position. Some things, as a servant, it was better for him not to say too much. But why did it have to be the moat that had a problem? When will the eminent monks arrive? Hellion Vivian changed the topic with a light smile, as if she wanted to make Eunuch's son feel more relaxed. Eunuch's son pulled out of his thoughts. I heard that it's tomorrow at noon. It's not easy to find so many respected masters all of a sudden. We have to prepare more on time. That's right. Hellion Vivian lowered her eyes and took another sip of tea. The corner of her mouth hooked up into a cold smile. Yuanming took advantage of the fact that Eunuch's son couldn't see him and approached Hellion Vivian's ear with an evil smile. They are so well prepared. It seems that they deliberately want to kill you. As soon as Elder Yun died, they became anxious. Hellion Vivian widened her eyes. The more anxious they are, the more it means that they are afraid. My grandfather was a military man, but he died a strange death. Now, it's clear who's behind this. Yuanming raised his eyebrows, but his smile didn't diminish. At that time, I was able to come to your side because you had hatred in your heart. That's why you woke me up in that kind of situation. Later on, Madame Su died, and that heartless father of yours was hacked to death by Prime Minister Su by the side of the road. The Hellion family was once again in your hands, but I didn't extricate myself from the contract. Without taking my revenge, I can't leave. From the very beginning, this matter wasn't simple. Hellion Vivian played with the teacup in her hand. Otherwise, why do you think I let the Su family stay for so long? Yuanming shrugged. That's what you say, but with your current ability, you can split them up and deal with them one by one. Once they join hands, I'm afraid that your future path will be very difficult. Previously, you were always in the dark. Because of your trash status, they didn't take precautions at all. Now, they are taking the initiative to attack. Are you sure you can withstand it? How long do you think I can last tomorrow? Hellion Vivian asked Yuanming in return. Yuanming stretched his waist. The current you is completely different from the time of your wedding. If it wasn't for the deep resentment in the palace, these scriptures might not have been able to force you out. What I'm afraid of is that you have been dreaming a lot recently, and your soul has long been somewhat unstable. If you're lucky, you can hold on for an hour. An hour? Hellion Vivian narrowed her eyes. These masters chant scriptures in the early hours of the morning and at night. I don't have to appear, but they actually want to enter the palace by any means possible. They must have already thought of a reason that I must be present. Yuan Ming smiled. No matter how you look at it, it's a dead end. You might as well just give me your soul, and I'll help you kill them. Yuan Ming, how many times have I told you I'm not interested in this deal of yours? Hellion Vivian stood up, her voice faint. As long as I'm still standing here, there's no such thing as a dead end. Chapter 538. Yuan Ming's interest was piqued. What do you plan to do? I'll make use of them to blow up the case in the palace. Then, I'll be able to investigate more thoroughly. Hellion Vivian played with the silver ring on her finger. However, I have a feeling that this case is not as simple as it seems. It is indeed not simple. Little White jumped out and said in a cold voice, I've just been to the river that the eunuch mentioned. The resentment is very strong. The bottom of the river has been dyed red with blood. According to the 5 elements and 8 trigrams, mountains belong to Yang and water belongs to Yin. Now that people have died in the water, it is simply a great ominous array. Then it leaped forward. Look over there. Hellion Vivian followed its gaze and squinted. Dead fish. Eunuch's son also heard Hellion Vivian's words and said, Sigh, don't mention it. I don't know what is going on. For 2 days in a row, these fish have died in batches. Maybe the water quality is not good. Hellion Vivian retracted her gaze and waved at the little one. The little 7th prince was seriously eating a meat bun. When he saw Hellion Vivian calling him, he walked over with his little face held high. He was very domineering. Third sister-in-law, do you want to beat someone up? Let's go now. Hellion Vivian was speechless. Other than eating, he only knew how to beat people up. Is this really okay? No, I want to tell you that you can eat fish, but you can't eat the floating ones. Do you understand? Hellion Vivian squatted down and looked into the little one's eyes. Her eyes were full of love. The little one looked at the surface of the lake and then turned his head around. His little face was full of seriousness. I know. The smell of those fishes has spread all the way here. Third brother has told me before that I can't touch smelly things. Smelly? Little White moved the tip of its nose, and its silver cat eyes darkened. Why didn't it smell it? Logically speaking, its sense of smell should be better than a child's. Yuan Ming smiled with an evil look. This little 7th prince is really interesting, isn't he? Little White raised its head and narrowed its eyes into a straight line. Do you know something? Is he on your side? Compared to you, I do know a little more. Yuan Ming smiled like a demon. The extra point is that I can be sure that he is not on our side. He does not have the demonic nature. Little White was in disbelief. Not a demon? Then what is he? No matter what he is, that woman has no intention of guarding against him. She even dotes on him like he's a treasure, so there's no need for us to find out. Yuan Ming looked at the surface of the lake and sighed deeply. I'm really becoming more and more handsome. Hellion Weiwei strolled over and pretended that she was going to burn the ancient book. Then I'll ask the increasingly handsome person to tell me everything you know. Little 7, what exactly is he? Haze. Yuan Ming jumped up and blew out the fire with a single breath. If there's anything you want to say it properly. Don't keep threatening this sovereign. Hellion Vivian put down the ancient book and crossed her arms. She raised her eyebrows and said, Speak. I'm just making some deductions. Yuan Ming smiled playfully. He has boundless strength at such a young age, and his sense of smell is so sharp. He is even more powerful than Bai Zai's descendant. From the moment he was born, his body was full of righteousness and was impervious to evil. Apart from spirit beasts, I really can't think of anything else that can be like this. Hellion Vivian frowned. You're saying that Shao-Chi is not a human, but a beast? Spirit beasts also have a human form. Little White's voice was indifferent. Our bodies are divided into beast form and human form. It depends on which form is more convenient. But why can't I feel any spirit beast's aura on his body? Yuan Ming smiled evilly. You can't feel it because he is too powerful. He can bite through the fire Qilin skin. Who do you think he is? You're saying that he Little White suddenly raised his eyes and looked at the little person who was squatting and playing with the ants. Impossible. This is absolutely impossible. When the exorcism seal fell and that person disappeared, even Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva couldn't appease him. That's why he didn't hesitate to summon the flames of hell in order to kill him. At that time, he was already swallowed by the flames, wasn't he? Yuan Ming laughed. Who knows what happened back then? Moreover, he is not like the fire Qilin. Even when he is always by that person's side, he rarely appears unless that person is in danger. Everyone says that the fire Qilin is the head of the 4 divine beasts because people often overlook it. If you think about it carefully, he's the one who has been by that person's side the longest. He is also the one who is the most difficult to deal with. Otherwise, why can't Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva appease him? But how did he turn into a child? Little White hesitated and looked at the little person. Hellion Vivian could naturally hear the voices of these 2 people. She said indifferently, maybe he didn't change. That's right. Who said that he must change? Yuan Ming's eyes glowed. Maybe it's because his human form is that of a child. That's why that person, who doesn't even care about gods and demons, dotes on him endlessly. Hellion Vivian's expression was indifferent. That's not important. What's important is that Little Seven's abilities are different from ordinary people, but he can't control them well. Help me keep an eye on him in the future. Don't let the 4 great elders find out about him. You don't need us to keep an eye on him. Yuan Ming looked at the forest on the right. Your man has protected him very well. His abilities definitely didn't show up at this time. It's your man who's been good at using his methods for so many years that his abilities haven't been magnified. It's hard to control them recently. It's probably because the resentment in the palace is too strong. Just like in the White Academy, someone tried to use resentment to tame the divine dragon. However, the array formation this time isn't directed at him. When the little one saw that Hellion Vivian was standing there motionless, he immediately pricked up his little ears and called out, "Third sister-in-law, I've finished my meat buns." Hellion Vivian turned around and smiled. "Come here. I'll wipe your hands for you. You can eat the second one." "Okay." The little one nodded heavily and obediently stretched out his 2 little hands. Hellion Vivian smiled. She took the little one's hands and wiped them with a handkerchief. Then she divided the meat bun into 2 halves and only gave him half. "Eat less. I'll make black pepper beef for you tonight." "Beef." The little one's eyes lit up. He touched his body with a fierce expression. At first, Hellion Vivian didn't know what he was touching. When he pulled out the snake head from his clothes and threw it to the side in a domineering manner, Hellion Vivian pressed her forehead. "Little Seven, why are you grabbing these dangerous things?" Chapter 539. It's food. Little 7th Prince said seriously, "But I don't need it now. It's not as delicious as beef." "Green snake. You're so capricious. Have you considered our feelings as snakes?" Little 7th Prince saw that the snake was not moving, so he bent down and poked it with his finger. He said in a domineering manner, "Go away, or I'll feed you to the fire Qilin." Hearing the name of the fire Qilin, the green snake's expression changed. It disappeared into the bushes with a whoosh. Hellion Vivian found it funny. She pulled the little one over and walked side by side with him. "What else do you want to eat besides beef?" "Anything is fine." Little 7th Prince could be very calm sometimes. He was not a picky eater. Hellion Vivian said slowly, "How about I make you some potato chips?" "Potato chips?" The little one's eyes lit up as he scratched his little ears. He was very excited. "Okay." Hellion Weiwei watched as he kept scratching a certain spot, so she ordered someone to bring some medicine to stop the itch. Then, she said, "Then I'll make a plate of potato chips for you first. You can watch me cook while you eat?" "Okay." The little one nodded obediently. Hellion Vivian was almost melted by his cuteness. She smiled faintly and applied the medicine on his ears. The little one did not hide. Instead, he pouted and complained to Hellion Vivian, "Mosquitoes, you're so annoying. They bit you. Of course you'd hate them." Hellion Vivian rubbed his soft ears. The little one shook his little head and said, "Third sister-in-law, you're wrong. It's not because they bit me. It's because they're too dirty to eat. Hellion Vivian. Okay, she was wrong again. She should not have thought of a foodie as an ordinary person. To prevent the little one from saying something shocking again, Hellion Vivian quickly cut the potato chips as soon as they returned to the palace. Her knife skills were very good. The shredded potatoes were cut neatly. She wrapped them with flour and then put them in the oil pan. It was crispy and tender on the outside, fragrant and crunchy in the mouth. Her mouth was filled with the rich fragrance of potatoes, and there was also a layer of grape jam on the side, which was what the imperial kitchen used to make snacks. The little one was eating happily. His little body followed beside Hellion Vivian. He stared at the chopping board while eating potato chips. He looked adorable. Eunuch's son watched from the side in disbelief. Wang Fei really has a way. In this way, Master will be much more relaxed. The little eunuch behind him was very perceptive. He handed a cup of tea to Eunuch's son. Eunuch's son took it and drank a mouthful. Who said otherwise? In the past, when the royal family was busy, I had to chase after His Highness all over the palace. Now, there's someone who can cure him. Other than His Highness, he is only so obedient in front of Wang Fei. Even when he was in front of Headmaster Tu Su, he was not so worry-free. By the way, you also have to watch His Highness. Recently, the palace is in chaos. There are some places that you can't go. You must be on guard in advance. This palace, I'm afraid, is going to change. Yes. The little eunuch took the order and left in the evening. In the hall, the lights were shining. A man in white stood, looking weak and elegant. The three elders have thought it through. Do you really want to lure the eminent monks into the palace? Even you said that this Hellion Vivian is very likely to be possessed by someone. One of the elders sneered. If she knows her place, it's fine. But if she keeps pushing us, we have no reason to let her go. We used to underestimate this girl. I didn't expect that she would do so many things in less than 2 months. Tu Su Feng brought her into the battle spirit forces and targeted us. Who knows what kind of methods she will use to deal with us in the future. That year, we gave face to her grandfather and spared her life. Now it's time to cut the weeds and dig up the roots. The white-clothed man smiled. Elder Wu, do you really think that Hellion Vivian dealing with the 4 elders was Tu Su Feng's doing? What do you mean, young masters? The other elders who were drinking tea paused. The white-clothed man turned around. His fair and handsome face revealed a sickly look. That year, the Hellion family was exterminated. Old Master Hellion died strangely. In the end, only Hellion Vivian was left. The reason why the various elders allowed her to stay was not because of Elder Hellion's face, but because of the Hellion blood in her body. It was said that the Hellion blood had the innate power of exorcism. Once someone possessed it, their martial chi would greatly increase. She is just a little girl. It's a pity to kill her. It's better to keep her as a blood bank. The elders did this, so they must have left behind some clues. Since I can find it, the current Hellion Vivian will definitely be able to find it as well. Therefore, it was not Tu Su Feng's idea to overthrow the elders. He would not do things with such a clear goal. The one who really wanted to get rid of the elders was Hellion Vivian herself. Then all the more reason to get rid of her. Elder Wu narrowed his eyes and put down the teacup in his hand. His eyes were filled with poisonous intent. The other 2 elders' faces also darkened. The incident that year was a grudge in their hearts. Once it was known by everyone, the image of the 4 elders protecting the Dragon War Empire for many years would be destroyed. Their supreme authority would also be affected. Therefore, Hellion Vivian must be eliminated. The man in white turned his back, lowered his eyes, and lightly coughed a few times. Hellion Weiwei's identity is not ordinary. It's not that easy to deal with her. How difficult it is to deal with that prince in the palace. I'm sure the 3 elders are clearer than me. How can you guarantee that the plan will be absolutely foolproof? Young master need not worry about this. Elder Wu took a sip of tea and smiled sinisterly. With the Emperor's help, no matter how difficult it is to deal with the 3rd prince, it will be useless. When the time comes, when the eminent monks start chanting, Hellion Vivian will definitely show her true form. The white-clothed man stopped his fingers and did not say anything else. Instead, the corner of his mouth curved into a mocking smile. When the sun had completely set and only Elder Ming was left in the hall, he opened his mouth again. When you enter the palace tomorrow, remember what I told you. Once the eminent monks finish chanting, regardless of whether Elder Wu succeeds or not, you must lure Hellion Vivian to the riverside. Master, I will naturally accomplish what you said. Elder Ming's posture was very strange. His head was drooping, and his mouth was letting out a hoarse laugh. The white-clothed man faintly glanced at him. You have been a human for so many days, but you still can't learn the habits of a human. Remember, no matter what, you must not reveal the slightest clue, especially your sitting and standing posture. If there is even the slightest mistake, you know what the result will be. Chapter 540. Master, don't worry. I'm only acting like this in front of you. It's normal in front of others. Elder Ming stuck out his tongue and licked his hand. His entire body was filled with demonic aura. It's just that wearing the skin is really uncomfortable. I'm afraid that I won't be able to control myself and will want to eat people when those monks start chanting. Hearing this, the man in white raised his finger and an invisible talisman appeared on Elder Ming's body. With this talisman, no matter how those monks chant, they won't be able to affect you. Master has a way. Elder Ming straightened his neck, but he was still a little afraid. Beligaju, the man in white, looked at him. The more you care, the more you lose your usual shrewdness. Elder Wu, since you're dealing with Hellion Vivian, Beligaju will definitely try his best to protect Hellion Vivian's soul and neglect you instead. I want you to take advantage of this gap to do everything. Go, bring Hellion Vivian to me. With her blood, the divine exorcism seal can be completely activated. Yes. Elder Ming grinned. His eyes gradually turned blood red in the gloomy darkness. Outside the main hall, Elder Jean looked back. The more he thought about it, the stranger he felt. He decided to voice out his doubts. Elder Wu, don't you think that young master seemed to be holding back when he spoke to us this time? Elder Wu's eyes darkened as he looked to the west. Young master has always been mysterious. This is nothing. But this time, we can't simply force Hellion Weiwei's soul out of her body and call it a day. The third prince has cut off all the benefits in the provincial capital. If this goes on, think about it carefully. What will happen to you and me when he takes the throne one day? If we investigate the fire in the palace back then, both of us won't be able to escape. What do you mean, Elder Wu? Elder Wu's voice turned cold. Drag the third prince down as well. With the retired emperor's protection, the third prince won't be dragged down so easily. For these elders to be able to sit in their current positions, each one of them had their own wisdom. Elder Jean naturally had his own ideas. Elder Wu chuckled and lowered his voice. What if the emperor wants the third prince to die? You want to use the Hellion Vivian incident to pin the crime of treason on the third prince? Elder Jean quickly understood what his colleague meant, but he still felt that it was inappropriate. It's not that easy. Elder Wu turned around and looked at him. Everything depends on the person. The third prince married a possessed person into the palace. This itself is a great taboo of the royal family. In addition to his actions during this period, I'm afraid it would be difficult for the emperor to tolerate him even if he wanted to. All these years, His Majesty has always been like us, wanting to live forever. For this reason, he has been addicted to pills. Others might not understand his true intentions, but how could Elder Jean not understand? He doesn't want to be like the retired emperor, handing over his power to others when he's old. Now that the third prince has performed so well, and the fifth prince and the empress are no longer around, there's no one to help him maintain the balance in the court. According to His Majesty's character, it's hard for him not to want to make a move on the third prince, just like how he acquiesced to us attacking the Hellion family. Elder Wu said the last sentence very slowly. So slowly that Elder Jean's eyes darkened. What do you want to do? Elder Wu knew that he had agreed. He leaned over and whispered something in a low voice. After hearing this, Elder Jean nodded slightly and praised, "You're indeed Elder Wu, to be able to come up with such a beautiful plan. His Majesty hasn't been peaceful these past few days. Once the provincial capital's matter is settled, many officials have begun to clamor for the third prince to be the official crown prince. How do you think he can sleep peacefully? Elder Wu laughed as if victory was already in his hands. Now that the fifth prince has been deposed and the empress is imprisoned in the cold palace, it's normal for a prince without any power to make a last stand. It's normal for him to bring soldiers into the palace to force the emperor to abdicate. When that time comes, the third prince will definitely use his power in the military to protect the palace. However, the situation is different now. Since His Majesty already has the intention to get rid of him, then he can be the one to protect the palace, but not the third prince. Once the third prince makes a move, my men will directly sneak into his palace to hide the dragon robe. When that time comes, His Majesty can completely say that the third prince is the one with the true intention of rebelling. Elder Jean stroked his beard. What if the third prince doesn't move a single soldier? He's an extremely profound person. After so many years, I've never been able to see through him. Although the plan this time is perfect, it's a little rushed. It's not impossible for him to see through the knack of it. If he doesn't move a single soldier and just stands in the imperial court without moving at all or giving orders, then this matter will be even easier to handle. Elder Wu is full of pride. Once I get my hands on it, I'll directly point out in the imperial court that these so-called rebel soldiers are merely using the fifth prince's name. In fact, the third prince is the one who's actually forcing the emperor to abdicate. Otherwise, why wouldn't he move a single soldier to protect the emperor? Elder Jean gave a thumbs up as he listened. This plan is beyond words. If he moves, then he's plotting a rebellion. If he doesn't move, then he's plotting something. Unless there's someone who can help him block this attempt to force the emperor to abdicate, otherwise, His Majesty will definitely be ruthless to the third prince this time. That's right. Elder Wu smiled sinisterly. Elder Jean thought for a moment and said, if we want this to be foolproof, it's best to first pin Hellion Vivian's crime on the head. This way, the third prince will be too busy to think of anything else. Rest assured, Elder Jean. Elder Wu smiled. On the day of the wedding, Hellion Vivian did not make a fool of herself because of the appearance of the fire Qilin. During the chanting of the scriptures tomorrow, whether it's you, me, or her and the third prince, all of us will have to stay in the palace. With His Majesty around, no one will be allowed to bring any spiritual beasts in. When that time comes, Hellion Vivian will have no choice but to die. Clatter. The emperor sneered and threw the memorial in his hand to one side. His voice was clearly filled with anger. Another memorial that's forcing me to appoint the crown prince as soon as possible. I'm still on the throne, and they're already so bold.
Crash.
All the memorials on the sandalwood table were swept to the ground by the emperor's sleeve. Eunuch Gao, who was serving the emperor, was so frightened that he trembled. The emperor could not stand anyone now, what more a servant. He kicked the eunuch to vent his anger. The retired emperor is also a muddle-headed old man. Instead of doting on his son, he chose to dote on his grandson. Chapter 541. The Crown Prince. The emperor laughed gloomily. Without my approval, he will never be the crown prince in his life. Chaoyang Hall was destined to be restless tonight. Eunuch Gao dragged his aching body. No one could understand the grievance in his heart. He had been by the emperor's side for 30 years, but he was worse than a beast. In my opinion, the emperor can't bear it anymore. Nangong Lai, who had been staying in the temple of ancestral worship all this time, directly told Beligaju after receiving the news, Ju, I always feel that there must be something behind this. You should be careful these days. Even though the emperor has been obsessed with alchemy all these years, the palace is still his after all. Beligaju sat on the wooden chair with his legs slightly crossed. His handsome side profile was as cold as ice. Nangong Lai didn't say much. After all, he knew Beligaju best. When he was young, Ju was not liked by the empress. Now that he had grown up, even the emperor was wary of him. Nangong Lai shook his head and sighed in his heart. When he left, it was already late at night. Bailey Jiaju was shrouded in the night fog as he returned to the palace. The servants below could almost see the coldness in his eyes. One after another, they bowed their heads and served him on his left and right. When he approached the dragon bed, there was finally some warmth in his long and narrow eyes. It was not because of anything else, but because of the person lying in the cage. Her wrists were locked by an iron chain. She slept peacefully, with one side empty, as if deliberately left a space for him. If it were anyone else, they would have been unable to stand him being locked in such a cage. Except for her. Baligaju felt something warm in his chest. He leaned over and took the only person he had into his arms. Hellion Vivian, who was sleeping, was very docile. She leaned over according to Baligaju's intention, and even put her arm naturally on Hellion Vivian's waist. Baligaju curved his thin lips and kissed her on the top of her head. Now, she was completely defenseless against him. Previously, in order to obtain this person, he did not hesitate to go against his style of doing things and set up that marriage contract, just to get her into bed with him. When they first got married, she was still distant from him. Even when the two of them were lying together, she would stick close to the wall, afraid to touch him. Now, she was so obedient that he couldn't bear to part with her. That was why one had to be patient and skillful in rearing a cunning prey like a fox. Oh. Wei Wei was moved by the cold aura of his body. That exposed part of the fair skin on her abdomen, which was still rising and falling slightly along with her breathing, was like a defenseless little beast. Is it daybreak? Bailey Jiaju was indeed a qualified breeder. He stretched out his hand and pulled her over again. He patted her back and said in a deep and pleasant voice that sounded like a pre-recorded lullaby, "Not yet. Go back to sleep. Then wake me up when the sun rises. I want to make beans for you." She basically murmured the last few words. Baligaju looked at her. Even his usually thin lips had some lingering gentleness. The moonlight shone through the wooden window and shone on the two people sleeping in each other's arms. It was an indescribable combination. A chew. She didn't know if it was because she had woken up too early, but Hellion Vivian sneezed as soon as she got out of bed. Her foot missed and kicked the head of the bed, hurting herself. Baligaju was standing by the window with a fur-colored towel in his hand. When he heard the noise, he looked over. When he turned to look at Hellion Vivian, the lines of his neck were stretched and there was a strong sense of abstinence. "Come here." Hellion Vivian subconsciously swallowed her saliva and looked to the other side. "What are you doing?" "Looking at your feet," Baligaju said as he handed the towel to the servant beside him. Hellion Vivian nodded. Just as she was about to bend down to put on her shoes, someone grabbed her waist and easily pulled her up. When she reacted, she was already in the air and sitting on the sandalwood dressing table. Baligaju's hands were on both sides of her. He lowered his body, and his beautiful long and narrow eyes were at the same level as Hellion Vivian's. His voice was deep. "Lift your feet." In this position, Hellion Vivian obviously wouldn't lift her feet. She just looked at him and said, "It doesn't hurt. It's just a touch." "It's red from a touch." Baligaju moved closer and almost forced her into a corner. His presence was so strong that Hellion Vivian couldn't ignore it. She didn't know if it was because of the morning light shining on his face, but it made his face look more handsome and three-dimensional. Hellion Vivian thought to herself that she finally saw what it meant to have a natural flash effect. His Highness was a monster no matter where he was. "You're looking at me like this. Do you want me to continue what I did last night?" Baligaju chuckled and moved closer to her ear. His voice was very long. Hellion Vivian's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to push him away, but he pushed her back. Baligaju turned his face slightly and leaned towards Hellion Vivian. The closer his eyes were, the more her heart beat. Hellion Wei Wei's fingers clutched her clothes and subconsciously leaned back. "Wait a minute, Baligaju didn't seem to give her a chance to escape. His right hand was free, and he skillfully held the back of her head. His thin lips pressed against hers. The slightly cold touch and the familiar sandalwood smell were very intoxicating. Hellion Vivian gasped for breath. Her entire body was in his embrace. When the kiss landed on her neck, she reached out to stop him. No, I still have to make a basket of bean paste buns for you and Xiao Qi. He'll wake up later, and you can eat them together. Don't you like bean paste? It can warm your stomach. Hearing this, Beligaju's fingers loosened. He looked at the bright and beautiful little face in front of him and couldn't help but be stunned. When did he say that he liked bean paste? She was acting on her own again. Although she said so, the indifferent royal prince ate more than anyone else after receiving the bean paste buns. It was enough to show that the bean paste buns were to his liking. The rest of the food was taken away by little Seven. He held a chopstick in his hand and another in his mouth. He sat in front of Helian Weiwei and Bailey Jiaju in a dignified manner. He held a pair of chopsticks in his left hand and sat in a domineering manner. Eunuch Sun took advantage of this time to mention to Beligaju the ministers who wanted to come in recently. He wanted to let His Highness see more of them. It would be helpful in the future. Beligaju looked at the residue on Xiao Qi's face and frowned. His tone was as indifferent as usual. Reject them all. Eunuch Sun was stunned and whispered, but the Ministry of War is also among them. Chapter 542. Rejected. Beligaju glanced at him and wiped his fingers with a white handkerchief. He didn't explain further. Eunuch Sun's head drooped even lower as he looked at Helian Vivian. He probably wanted Helian Vivian to persuade him. After all, if he didn't see anyone, he wouldn't be able to do well in the court. Wasn't His Highness very smart in the past? Why couldn't he understand this time? Eunuch Sun waited anxiously and gestured with his mouth. Helian Vivian stood up. While taking the bowl, she smiled at him. Eunuch Sun is really loyal to His Highness. You even made a face. Wang Fei, don't make fun of us. Eunuch Sun tapped his foot and looked inside. His Highness won't see anyone. What should we do in the future? Helian Vivian sniffed the bean paste bun in her hand and said in a very soft voice, Eunuch Sun, do you think His Highness should see these officials now? The situation isn't right. Eunuch Sun paused. The situation isn't right. After we came back from the provincial capital, whether it was the Ministry of Appointments or the Ministry of War, they all said that they want the Emperor to appoint His Highness as the heir apparent as soon as possible. It's been 4 or 5 days, but the Emperor hasn't made a move. The corners of Helian Weiwei's mouth carried a smile as she took a bite of that steaming hot red bean bun. This only proves one thing. The Emperor doesn't want to appoint an heir apparent so early. If His Highness goes to make friends with the officials of the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Defense at this time, he will be inviting trouble for himself. Naturally, it's better not to see these people. It will also prevent the Emperor from thinking too much. When Eunuch Sun heard Helian Vivian's words, a layer of cold sweat immediately appeared on his forehead. Wang Fei means that the Emperor has already started to... I don't mean anything. Helian Vivian picked another apple from the basket and spun in a circle, but I think His Highness just doesn't want to see them. If he wanted to see them, he wouldn't care about these things. The closer she got to Beligaju, the more Helian Vivian knew that the outside world's sanctity was fake. The real him was afraid of dirtying his hands with blood. People said that he was ruthless, but in Helian Vivian's eyes, he was a little prince without a childhood. Although he had some tricks up his sleeve, she liked him very much. If he didn't have any means to protect himself, wouldn't he be waiting for death in a place like the Imperial Palace? What's more, how could he be blamed for this? Even the Emperor couldn't tolerate him, let alone other people. Third sister-in-law, what are you talking about with Eunuch Sun? The little one lifted his head with a bean bun in his mouth. Beligaju followed his gaze and looked at Helian Vivian. Helian Vivian smiled and raised the apple in her hand. I'll ask Eunuch Sun to be careful. The next time he comes, he'll bring more fruit. I can make fruit yogurt for you and your third brother. A fruit yogurt? The little one nodded with a serious face. Not bad. It sounded delicious. Helian Vivian was amused by his little adult appearance. She patted his head and sat back beside Beligaju. Beligaju looked at her indifferently. So, Eunuch Sun will definitely be more careful in the future? What the princess said, what the prince wants, this old servant will definitely be more careful. Eunuch's son was smart. After a while, he went out and sent everyone away. His words were good, neither unfamiliar nor friendly. Beligaju naturally knew what the two of them were talking about. He looked down at the little one who was picking snacks and dried fruits for him. A faint smile appeared on his thin lips. Hellion Vivian happened to see that smile. She looked at the dried mango in her hand in confusion and asked blankly, "You like to eat this? Then I'll leave it to you in the future." Beligaju pulled her over, raised her hand, and kissed it. This silly fox, he had to watch over her no matter what. Hellion Vivian smiled brightly and let him kiss her. She looked very naughty. "Do you find that I'm good to you? Don't always lock me up in the future. Let me lock you up too. Okay. Then I can be more good to you." "Wait, what did you just say?" Hellion Vivian suspected that there was something wrong with her ears. Beligaju reached out and held her waist. His voice was charming. "Come back tonight. I'll let you lock me up for a night."
How about that?
So easy to talk to? Hellion Vivian slowly narrowed her eyes. Bailey Jiaju curled his lips into a faint smile. "Isn't it to make you treat me better? I want twice as many locks as usual." In order to prevent him from playing tricks, it had to be like this. For Hellion Vivian, this was an opportunity, no matter what. To be honest, a man like Beligaju, any woman who saw his restrained and cold appearance would want to lock him up. This man was very suitable for dark things. For example, handcuffs, or guns that could kill people. Hellion Vivian had wanted to tie him up for a long time. As the queen of firearms, it was rare to see such a suitable man to tie up, so her hands were very itchy. Unfortunately, the difference in strength between her and the enemy was too great. In terms of insidiousness, she couldn't compare to a certain highness. Now that he took the initiative to deliver himself to her, of course, she couldn't refuse. Thinking of this, Hellion Vivian happily began to plan what kind of lock to use to lock up the most handsome man in the world at night. Only then would she be able to fully display his porcelain-like exquisite beauty. She didn't even notice the smile on her face. Beligaju put his slender fingers on her head and couldn't help but smile again. She was only tied up once, and she was so happy. It was really easy to get rid of, "Your Highness." As if he had something to report, Shadow walked in from outside. When he saw Hellion Vivian and Little Seven, he had a hesitant expression on his face. Hellion Vivian knew that they were going to talk about business, so she called Little Seven over. "Let's go, we're going outside to get some sun." Little Seven reached out his hand and pulled on Hellion Vivian's sleeve. Beligaju said in a faint voice, "Wait for Shadow to finish his report, then we'll go out together." Hellion Vivian looked back and smiled. Okay. She had always felt that there were some things that he didn't want her to know. Why was it an exception this time? In fact, there was no exception this time. Shadow's report was undoubtedly bloody. For Beligaju, he didn't want her to see the things that anyone could see. But on the other hand, he desperately wanted her to know that he was that kind of person. He would do anything, and his hands were stained with blood. "Your Highness." This was the first time Shadow saw such an expression on His Highness's face. He hesitated whether he should say it or not. Beligaju's handsome face was indifferent, and his voice was emotionless. "Say it." "Yes." Shadow lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "The few eminent monks that the elders found have all been dealt with. According to your Highness's instructions, none of them were left alive."
Ew.
When Hellion Vivian heard this, she glanced at Beligaju. "You had people kill those monks who entered the palace to chant scriptures?" Beligaju's hand that was hidden in his sleeve tightened. His slightly cold voice carried a hint of self-mockery.
"What?
Do you think that this highness is too cruel?" Chapter 543. Hellion Vivian was silent for a while before she said, "Wouldn't it be more sinful to kill these monks?"
So what?
Beligaju clenched his cold fingers. He regretted asking Ining to speak. Wasn't it obvious? He looked perfect on the surface. In fact, he didn't know how to do anything other than killing people and scheming. There was no need to differentiate between sinful and not sinful. If it was in the past, he would directly go to the temple where these monks came from and slaughter them. But now it's nothing. Hellion Vivian chuckled and interrupted his thoughts. I just feel that I should go to the hidden spirit temple again and burn some incense for you. As she spoke, she raised her eyes and hooked her arm around Bailey Jiaju's. She smiled at him and said, Next time, leave this kind of thing to me. Your hands are so beautiful. Don't get them stained with blood. Besides, those monks originally came for me. They came to the palace to quell the chaos. If you kill them, how are you going to explain it to the emperor? Is this what you want to say? Beligage's deep eyes seemed to be stirred up by layers of ripples. It was different from the usual cold, deep heat. He didn't believe it before, but now he believed it. In this world, there would always be a person who could make you forgive all the hardships you have suffered. For him, Hellion Vivian was that existence. Hellion Vivian nodded. Is it wrong to say this? That's right. Bailey Jiaju smiled slowly. He leaned over and kissed her on the lips. This kiss came too suddenly. Hellion Vivian suddenly froze on the spot. Her nose was full of the man's unique mint smell.
Her heart beat a little faster.
There were so many people around. In addition to Little Seven, there was also Eunuch Sun and Aning. Hellion Vivian just tasted that charming and slightly cold sandalwood scent. She reached out and pushed him away. The tips of her ears were red. Can you pay attention to your image a little? Who asked you to seduce me? Beligage snickered. When other people hear Shadow's report, they would always label me as the devil. But you, on the other hand, are protecting a devil like me. Hellion Vivian wiped the blush from his kiss. She didn't even raise her head and directly replied, If I don't protect you, who will I protect? You are my man.
Oh.
Beligaju curved his thin lips and picked her up. Then I'll have to trouble Madam. Hellion Vivian shrugged. That's nothing, but killing a few monks shouldn't solve anything. Wang Fei is wise. Aning coughed twice and finally found his voice. This time, the House of Elders has put in a lot of effort. They invited 3 groups of eminent monks in a row. We only killed the first group. Although we didn't leave any traces, it will be difficult to do it again. After all, it was the Emperor's idea to invite the eminent monks into the palace. Hellion Vivian nodded, telling Aning to come back. There's no need to kill those eminent monks. But Aning looked at Beligaju. Beligaju's slender fingers carelessly twirled Hellion Vivian's hair and nodded without a trace. Only then did Aning reply, Yes. You're in such a hurry. It shouldn't be just for this matter, right? Hellion Vivian took a sip of tea and smiled. Tell me all about it. I'm actually quite interested in His Highness' affairs. Aning looked at Beligaju again and said, The informant from the Ministry of War has sent news. The Empress's former subordinates have been restless recently. Today they even gathered together. I don't know what they want to do. The Empress's former subordinates? Hellion Vivian's eyes narrowed and her voice sank. Even if she was a transmigrator, she knew that something was about to happen. The most likely thing was that they were plotting a rebellion. Hellion Vivian's fingers paused for a moment. Then she stood up. However, Bailey Jiaju only listened quietly. There was not a single ripple on his handsome face. Aning tentatively asked, Your Highness, shouldn't we make some preparations? First, we should transfer the garrison outside the city to wait outside the Meridian Gate. No need. Beligaju reached out and put down the teacup in his hand. His voice was faint. Go and investigate who organized the Empress's former subordinates. The 5th prince is under house arrest, the Empress is locked up in the palace, and the Morong clan has long been disbanded. Now that they've come out to make trouble, no matter how you look at it, there's a problem. And Ing responded with a yes, but he was still worried. Your Highness, since there's a problem, then they must have come prepared. Is it really okay if we don't transfer the garrison? At this time, we can't transfer the garrison. Bailey Jiaju's voice was very flat, as if this matter had nothing to do with him at all. The troops stationed in the city are supposed to protect the safety of the capital. They should be obeying the Emperor's orders. If I really have the ability to touch them, even if I helped Imperial Father block the rebels who tried to force the abdication, Imperial Father would still blame me for this matter. He might even directly pin the crime of rebellion on me because a prince shouldn't have led the troops into the palace.
Eh.
And Ing was dumbfounded. The Emperor won't do this, right? Why wouldn't he? He's just taking advantage of the situation. Beligaju slowly turned his sleeves. And Ing was anxious. Then, Your Highness, what should we do? We can't just watch those people kill their way into the palace, right? At that time, won't the Emperor say that you didn't do anything? It's more than just not doing anything. Beligaju curved his thin lips. All right, you can leave now. I have a way to deal with this matter. Tell all the shadow guards, no matter what happens, don't move. And Ing didn't say anything else, but don't move? Is this really okay? Time passed by little. Unlike the peace in the palace, the sound of the wind blowing through the grass outside the palace was especially loud. In a secret tea house in the west of the city, where few people came and went, a few shadows gathered and were secretly plotting something. The general with the sword pointed at a scroll of the palace's inner courtyard and lowered his voice. When the sky turns dark, someone will open this door for us in advance. At that time, we just need to quietly go in and directly approach the Chaoyang Palace. We can only succeed. We can't fail. Yes. This was their only chance. The Morong clan had lost their leader, and the Empress was suppressed in the cold palace. The Emperor didn't care about their excessive friendship, and the third prince wanted to kill them all. So, they had to do this. According to the Elder's plan, even if they didn't succeed in forcing the third prince to abdicate. As long as the third prince sent his army to stop them, the Emperor would definitely not tolerate him and add the crime of rebellion to his name. It was worth it to drag the third prince down with them. Chapter 544. At noon, the eminent monk entered the palace. The three grand elders were by his side. They were there to appease the souls of the dead and purge the evil in the palace. Elder. When they entered the palace, the guard who received the palanquin went up to Elder Wu and whispered something to him. Others could not hear it clearly, but Elder Wu heard it clearly. He nodded with a smile on his face and walked to a dark corner. His eyes were filled with venom. He would like to see how Beligaju would deal with this. All these years, the Elder compound had always been restricted. Every time they did something, they had to consider Beligaju's counterattack. Now that there was such a great opportunity, they might as well get rid of him while the Emperor was distracted. They would like to see how he would bite them without his status as a prince. Elder Wu? Eunuch Gao stood at the entrance of the palace. He was here to receive the guests on behalf of the Emperor. Only then did Elder Wu come back to his senses. He smiled calmly. Eunuch Gao, is everyone here? We can't leave anyone out. The master said that the evil aura in the palace is too strong recently. If we don't get rid of the evil aura for the concubines and highnesses, I'm afraid we won't have peace.
Don't worry, Elder.
The concubines and highnesses will be here as long as His Majesty gives the order. Eunuch Gao replied with a smile. It's just that it's still early, and it's not time yet. In a while, the hall will be lively. Elder Wu nodded. When he looked down, the corner of his lips curled up slightly. He thought to himself gloomily, Hellion Vivian, no matter how capable you are this time, I'm afraid you'll have to stay in this palace for an hour and be tortured by the scriptures. I reckon you'll show your true colors in less than an hour. The sound of the blessing music slowly rang out. Unlike the past, this time, the music focused on peace and harmony. Beligaju gently twisted the jade pendant on his waist. His eyes were looking at the cloudless sky. His handsome side profile was as cold as a glacier. Have you found out? Yes, Shadow said softly. It's the Elder Compound's idea, but Beligaju raised his eyebrows. But what? I don't understand. How are they going to break in? And Ying's head was very low. Looking around, there were countless big and small palaces in the Imperial Palace. It would not be easy to break in. Bailey Jia Ju smiled casually. How do we break in? Of course, it's a collaboration between the inside and the outside. Otherwise, it would be hard for the Emperor to accuse me of plotting a rebellion. And Ing didn't know what to say. Since ancient times, even a vicious tiger wouldn't eat its own cubs. But in the imperial family, this was unavoidable. Beligaju put down the jade pendant he was fiddling with in his hand and quietly looked back. With an imposing manner that could change the weather with a flip of his hand, he said, "No matter what method they use, as long as the palace gate of Chaoyang Palace is not broken, you don't have to show up. Let them kill for fun. Since the emperor doesn't want me to move, then you don't have to rush to protect me." During this period of time, His Majesty has been muddle-headed. It just so happens that seeing some blood will also wake him up. After listening to Beligaju's words, Shadow finally understood what His Highness meant. If they didn't make a move, the ones who died were either the rebels or the Emperor's Imperial Guards. Anyway, they wouldn't be the ones who suffered losses. By the time those rebels really killed their way to Chaoyang Palace, they would have used up most of their strength. By that time, when they appeared again, they could simply clean up and solve this matter. It was undeniable that His Highness's idea this time was too insidious. Those elders definitely didn't expect His Highness to use this trick. Moreover, the ones who would send the troops would not be the Imperial Guards who could be used as excuses by them, Your Highness. From afar, Qingzhan hurried over and even forgot to salute. Chaoyang Palace sent a message saying that everyone in the Imperial Harem has to participate in the eminent monk's recitation of Buddha. Even the princes and princesses can't avoid it. The princess has been brought to Chaoyang Palace by the people over there. I saw that the princess didn't look good. I was afraid that something bad would happen, so I took the initiative to inform Your Highness. Please, Your Highness. Before Qingzhan could finish her words, she felt a piercing cold wind blowing past her face. When she looked up again, Beligaju was no longer in front of her. Beligaju slowly clenched his fists as his long sleeves fluttered in the wind. Even his deep eyes that were usually calm were overflowing with a chilling coldness.
How dare they?
Swoosh. Beligaju reached out and brushed away the light fur cloak that was handed to him by the servant. His slender figure was as fast as a shadow. There was no anxious expression on his face, but his eyes were faintly overflowing with an unusual light. In the darkness, it seemed like something fell. The strands of hair in front of his forehead successfully covered his eyes, so that no one could see the deep demonic nature. However, the smile on his sickly pale handsome face was so elegant and bloodthirsty. If his precious prey was harmed, he would make all of them regret being born into this world. Elder Ming? What's wrong with you, Elder Ming? Elder Wu looked at his colleague, who was trembling beside him, and frowned in confusion. The elder surnamed Ming tried his best to control the reaction in his blood. He shrunk his arm and hid his black fingernails under his long sleeve. He gave a fake smile and said, "It's nothing. It's just that my body hasn't been feeling well recently. I can't stand the wind." What was that wave just now? What was it? Elder Ming's expression was uncertain. He lowered his eyes and covered the red light that was overflowing from his eyes. Elder Wu did not notice his abnormality. He only replied, "Then Elder Ming should be careful." After that, he retracted his gaze and looked at Elder Zhan. Elder Zhan nodded at him subtly and guided him to look at Hellion Vivian, who was walking in. Elder Wu laughed. His voice was not very loud, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why is the third princess consort unwilling to come to the main hall? Is there something that you don't want the eminent monks to know?" "You, shut up." Before Hellion Vivian could speak, Little Seven blocked Elder Wu with a cool expression. That innate domineering aura actually caused Elder Wu to involuntarily take a step back. "What can I not want the eminent monks to know?" Hellion Vivian held Little Seven's hand and asked with a light smile, "Elder Wu's arrangement is strange." The recent cases in the Imperial Palace have all happened by the river. Elder Wu did not let the eminent monks go to the river to chant sutras and Buddha, but called us all to the main hall. "Is there something that you want to do?" Elder Wu had always been a thoughtful person. When he heard Hellion Vivian's words, his expression did not change at all. His pure white robe looked just as usual, chanting sutras and Buddha in Chaoyang Hall to expel the bad luck from the imperial consort's body is the consideration of the eminent monks. This is to prevent any evil from entering the inner palace. It's just chanting sutras with the eminent monks for an hour, yet the princess consort is so against it. It's easy for others to think too much. This old man has to ask, is there something that the princess consort does not want people to know? Chapter 545. Ever since I came in, Elder Wu's been saying that I'm hiding something. Hellion Vivian brushed the dust off her fingertips and said calmly, Elder Wu, do you have any evidence? Hearing this, Elder Wu slowly narrowed his eyes. Sure enough, he could not underestimate this girl anymore. Not only was she eloquent, but she also knew how to avoid the important and dwell on the trivial. However, her methods were fine for dealing with matters in the residence, but if she wanted to compete with him in the main hall, she was simply courting death. Elder Wu slowly opened his mouth. I don't have any evidence, but I've always had a doubt in my heart. Everyone in the capital city is spreading rumors that since the princess consort fell into the river, her temperament has changed drastically. She is no longer as arrogant and despotic as before. Even the things that you create are amazing. It's as if your soul has been taken away by some evil spirit. How do you explain this, princess consort? What does Elder Wu want me to explain? Hellion Vivian smiled. It's because I'm too arrogant and despotic that I've become a joke for 7 years. When grandfather passed away, although I was still young, I didn't forget the ancestral teachings of the Hellion family. The Hellion family has never produced cowards. If Elder Wu wants to see my arrogant and despotic side, then it's hard to say. As long as the Emperor agrees, I can beat you until your head is full of blood. As for the things that I create, you should ask my teacher, Grandmaster Jizun. He has taught me too well, so it's hard for some people to find fault with me. The princess consort is really good at talking. Elder Wu narrowed his eyes and clenched his fists. Hellion Vivian smiled calmly. Elder Wu is too kind. I'm just a little arrogant and despotic. You? Elder Wu clenched his fists and released them. A smile appeared on his face. I didn't believe in this matter at first, but after seeing the princess consort's attitude, I started to have doubts. Since the princess consort said so, why don't you just agree to recite the scriptures? This way, you can prove the princess consort's innocence. Hellion Vivian paused for a moment, but before she could say anything, Minister Wu is right. The emperor, who was sitting on the main seat, opened his mouth in a deep voice. Perhaps it was because he had been taking pills for a long time, but his complexion looked worse than the average person. The bags under his eyes were extremely heavy, and his hair was jet black. He especially looked like a drug addict from the modern era. It's just an hour of chanting Buddhist scriptures with an eminent monk. If you continue to refuse, the taste will change. This was a special time, so Hellion Vivian naturally wouldn't disobey the emperor's orders. She glanced sideways at Elder Wu before speaking to the emperor. Since your majesty has given the order, Wei Wei naturally wouldn't dare to refuse. However, Elder Wu doesn't have the slightest evidence, yet you claim that Wei Wei's soul was taken away by some evil creature. Isn't that too overbearing? Wang Fei, please don't dislike this old man's attitude. Possession is not a normal matter. If everything is normal with Wang Fei, when this matter is over, this old man will personally apologize to you. When Elder Wu saw that Hellion Vivian's words were getting weaker and weaker, his eyes were filled with pride. Princess consort, please. Hellion Vivian's clear eyes darkened. The little one held the bean paste bun in his mouth and looked left and right. Just as he was about to start fighting, Hellion Vivian stopped him. If Wang Fei still doesn't move, there will be a real problem. When Elder Wu's voice fell, many people were already looking in their direction. There was a faint fear in their eyes. I heard that the person who possessed the body likes to suck blood the most. Look at those palace maids who died in the imperial palace. Didn't they all have their blood sucked dry? Do you mean that Hellion Vivian is really, who knows? We'll only know when the eminent monks recite the scriptures later. Hellion Vivian held the little one's hand and took a step forward. She then knelt on the spot that belonged to her. Third sister-in-law. The little one held the bean paste bun in his hand in a dignified manner. Have a bite of the bean paste bun first. Don't worry, I promise third brother that I'll protect you. Hellion Vivian smiled and pinched his bun face. I'm not worried. With Xiaoqi around, what's there to worry about? I'll pass on your words to third brother. The little one took out another bean paste bun from his chest. While his third brother was not around, he asked very seriously, "Third sister-in-law, to be honest, am I more handsome and awesome than third brothers?" Helene Vivian held back her laughter. What do you mean? Otherwise, he wouldn't have asked me to dance all the time. He's just jealous that I'm more handsome than him. The little one took a bite of the bean paste bun angrily. Humph. Helene Vivian felt more and more that these two brothers were naturally arrogant. She reached out her hand to stroke their fur. Then, she heard countless scripture chants in the palace. She couldn't be more familiar with that mantra. Again and again, it drilled into her ears. Elder Wu watched the scene with a vicious gaze. She would not be able to hold on much longer. Calculating the time, the third prince and the retired emperor should be arriving soon. He really wanted to see the expressions on those two people's faces if they knew that the third princess consort that they had carefully selected was an evil being who had been possessed. However, Elder Wu's smile did not last for more than a minute. Beligaju, who was strolling in from outside, grabbed his neck immediately. Beligaju was too fast. He was so fast that no one was prepared for it. All they could see was a shadow flashing past their eyes. When Elder Wu came back to his senses, he realized that his whole body was lifted up. Your Highness. Cough, cough. What are you doing? Elder Wu tried his best to breathe, but he could not get rid of the fear in his heart. That feeling of suffocation made him disregard his image and shout at the Emperor, Your Majesty. Please save this old official. The Emperor's face showed his displeasure. Third brother. Put Elder Wu down. I can put him down if you want. Beligaju smiled faintly. He looked gentle, but he gave off a bloodthirsty aura. He has to give me an explanation for slandering my people. Elder Wu, you're just an elder at most. You're supposed to be a subordinate who shares the burden of the imperial family. What right do you have to threaten a princess consort? Of course, Elder Wu knew how difficult it was to deal with this person. He was not afraid of the emperor at all. He might really be strangled to death by him. No, he must think of a way. Elder Wu's eyes turned, and he tiptoed. His face started to turn green, and he kept coughing. I promise the princess consort. Cough, cough. If the princess consort is not possessed, I will apologize to the princess consort. Cough. Don't you want to know if the princess consort is really possessed? Chapter 546. I'm not interested in your speculations. Beligaju turned around and glanced at the little one beside Helene Vivian. His eyes darkened and his voice slowed down. He let go of Elder Wu and slowly tidied his robes. However, since the princess consort has promised you, I'd like to see what's going on with this preposterous idea of possession. Preposterous? Elder Wu clutched his neck and coughed violently. He thought to himself, when you see the shadow of a demon appearing behind Helene Vivian, you won't find it preposterous anymore. Go and tell the eminent monks to chant louder. Yes. In an instant, the Buddhist chants in the hall became louder. Helene Vivian's fingers paused. She held Xiaoqi and sat steadily. Elder Wu looked at her straightened back and laughed coldly in his heart. I'd like to see how long she can hold on. As for the third prince who was standing next to him, it was time for him, the god's favored one, to have a taste of being slapped in the face. No matter what, he was still an elder. The third prince did not give him any face at all. Just wait and see. Once I'm done with Helene Vivian, the next person I'll deal with is Beligaju. Your Highness, you'd better watch carefully. Elder Wu smiled and looked as if he was thinking for Beligaju. Usually, a person who possesses a body will sweat profusely and a black shadow will appear behind them. Although we can't catch the black shadow, we can still see it with our eyes. Your Highness, don't be distracted and miss out on any interesting scenes. Beligaju raised his eyes and looked at him slowly. That look was extremely cold. It was so cold that Elder Wu's scalp went numb. Then, he heard the person speak calmly. If there's no interesting scene to watch, I'll use Elder Wu's head as an example. It was just a few words, but it seemed to have lowered the temperature of the surroundings by a few degrees. Hearing this, Elder Wu narrowed his eyes even more. He knew from the beginning that no matter who was the emperor, the four great elders of the Elder Compound would always have the power that others could not have, and they would be loved and respected by the people. Only this third prince, who did not listen to reason or force, would one day destroy everything they had. That was why he made such a huge decision today. It's almost time now. Elder Wu strolled toward Helian Weiwei. Noticing the beads of sweat on her forehead, the smile on his face deepened. Princess Consort, don't force yourself. Not even half of the time has passed. If you're really uncomfortable, why don't you say it yourself? You'll be punished anyway. Why don't you let yourself suffer less? Elder Wu, where did you see that I'm? Helian Vivian smiled gently as she pinched Xiao Qi's hand. I heard the Buddha's voice and was chanting along. I took the opportunity to pray for His Highness and sweat a little. Elder Wu, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. I hope that the Princess Consort is right. You're only sweating a little. Princess Consort, you'll have to wait patiently. In less than an hour, the eminent monk's Buddhist teachings will not end. I'm really worried that the Princess Consort won't be able to take it. Elder Wu stood up again with a smile on his face and asked the monks to increase the volume of the chanting. In his heart, Helian Vivian was already at the end of her rope. She was like a grasshopper who was about to die and wanted to jump a few more times.
But
time passed slowly. Apart from sweating, Helian Weiwei actually didn't have any other signs. This made Elder Wu unable to sit still. He whispered a few words to the eminent monks. Yuan Ming watched from the side and laughed evilly. Woman, you're really smart to have thought of such a plan. I bet that old man would never have dreamed of how you could sit there so calmly. There are many things that he wouldn't have thought of. Helian Vivian's voice was lazy. Initially, I wanted to bribe those eminent monks. However, after thinking about it carefully, it's too dangerous. There are many of the elders' confidants among them. If I really took the silver, it would become evidence that they would not let me go. But Ligaju did not arrange it this way because of this. Moreover, Yuan Xiaobai said that Xiao Qi is more powerful than the Fire Qilin. If he's by my side, he'll definitely be able to withstand the eminent monk's Buddhist chanting. Since he can withstand it, of course I'll use him. It seems that Xiao Qi is much more low-key than the Fire Qilin. Xiao Bai's cold voice continued Helian Vivian's words. If His Highness Xiao Qi is really him, then he's not low-key at all. You've been talking about him for so long, I don't even know which one it is. Helian Vivian raised her eyebrows. In the end, which beast do you think Xiao Qi is? The little one's ears perked up. When he heard Helian Vivian mention his name, he frowned in confusion. Then, as if he had figured something out, he turned his handsome face to the side and said domineeringly, Third sister-in-law, do you want to eat bean buns? Helian Vivian. Indeed, Xiao Qi could relate anything to food. Third sister-in-law, don't be shy. If you want to eat, just tell me. I've brought a lot of bean buns. The little one said as he patted his small chest. The corner of Helian Weiwei's mouth twitched. He must have brought all the bean paste buns in the imperial kitchen here. How could he hide such a small body? Third sister-in-law doesn't want to eat. You eat. Helian Vivian smiled and rubbed the little one's head. She felt the prickling sensation in her palm. Xiao Qi, isn't it time for you to shave your hairs? The little one stopped eating his bean buns and stared at her with his round eyes. No. How can you not shave your hair? Won't the dean scold you? Helian Vivian did not forget how strict the dean was with him. The little one shook his head. Third elder brother took me back, so I don't have to follow the dean anymore. Actually, I know that after I leave, those senior uncles who fought with me in the White Academy will miss me. Helian Vivian. Then you're really thinking too much. It would be strange if they didn't welcome you. The more the adult and child chatted happily, the uglier Elder Wu's expression became. How could this be? It shouldn't be like this. At this time, Shouldn't Hellion Wei be unable to sit still and want to scratch her own face? Why did she look perfectly fine?
No.
Something must have gone wrong somewhere? Could it be that the eminent monks were chanting the wrong scripture? Impossible, he had checked every single one of them. Moreover, the eminent monks who entered the palace this time were the elder compound's trusted subordinates, so there should not be any mistakes. But why was there no change in Hellion Vivian at all? Faintly, Elder Wu seemed to have a bad feeling in his heart. Chapter 547. How long has it been? Elder Wu was obviously anxious. He turned around and asked the little eunuch beside him. Even his forehead was covered in a thin layer of sweat. Reporting to Elder, it's almost an hour. Once the hour was up, the eminent monks would stop chanting. If nothing happened to Hellion Vivian by then no way. He would never allow that to happen. At this moment, the little eunuch reminded Elder Wu, "Elder, it seems like it's time." Elder Wu turned around abruptly and glared at him fiercely. "I know very well whether it's time or not." The little eunuch did not understand why Elder Wu was so angry. He was so scared that he quickly shut his mouth. Elder Wu stared at Hellion Vivian's back. That was impossible. Something must have gone wrong. "I'm fine. I seem to have disappointed you, Elder Wu." Hellion Vivian smiled at him gently. The curve of her lips was like a slap to Elder Wu's face. He clenched his fists tightly, gritted his teeth, and ordered again. "Chant again." The eminent monks naturally listened to him, but there were inevitable pauses in the middle. The pauses would make his voice sound especially loud, so everyone looked in his direction. Hellion Vivian looked up and smiled. "Elder Wu, it's time. The eminent monks should be done exorcising the bad luck." "Elder Wu, are you asking the eminent monks to chant again and again because you want to pray for blessings or because you don't like me and want to accuse me?" Princess Consort is right. Nangong Lai slowly walked in from the outside. "Elder Wu, what you've done is really suspicious of your purpose. You didn't even tell us about the exorcism in the Imperial Palace. Instead, you troubled the eminent monks outside the palace. Elder Wu, what you've done is against the rules." As he spoke, he raised his eyebrows and glanced at Baligaju. What he meant was, "See, I came in time according to your order." Baligaju's expression did not change in the slightest. His side profile was indifferent, and his eyes were extremely cold. He also took a glance at Nangong Lai. However, his glance was much more black-bellied than Nangong Lai's. If one were to insist on using words to express what they were thinking, there were only 6 words. "Play him to death for this lord." Nangong Lai looked into his eyes and could not help but gulp. He wondered how Elder Wu had offended Ajub. He had actually given the death order so straightforwardly. Elder Wu was not aware of his situation yet, but he knew that inviting an eminent monk into the palace would offend the hall of worship. However, if Hellion Vivian could reveal her true form under the mantra, it would not matter what method was used. But he never expected that Hellion Vivian would be completely fine. "Your Majesty." Nangong Lai was still acting like a noble young master. "If your Majesty thinks that the hall of worship cannot protect the peace in the palace, you can drive the Nangong family out of the capital at any time. As long as your Majesty says so, I will do it. You don't have to invite some eminent monks and embarrass the hall of worship." The clan of worship was not a small matter in the entire divine land. Hearing Nangong Lai's words, the emperor no longer kept silent. His words were full of persuasion. "Allah, you think too much. I see that the hall of worship has been working day and night for the case. I don't want you to work too hard, so I agreed to Elder Wu's proposal. Besides, Elder Wu doesn't have any other thoughts. He is just worried that the palace will not be peaceful, so he wants to share my burden." If so, what did Elder Wu find out? Nangong Lai stood there, full of evil charm. Elder Wu did not speak. Hellion Vivian stood up and brushed the thin layer of dust off her body. Elder Wu found out nothing, but he refused to let me go. He kept saying that I was the one who possessed the body. He even had the eminent monks recite the soul-summoning mantra again and again. Soul-summoning mantra? Nangong Lai frowned. He turned his head and smiled evilly at Elder Wu. Elder Wu, I don't know much. Don't lie to me. I've been a priest for so long, but this is the first time I've heard that the soul-summoning mantra is used to pray for blessings. Are you trying to pacify your resentment? Or do you want to make the palace more restless? Elder Wu is really bold to lie to His Majesty so blatantly. Aren't you afraid of being beheaded? Elder Wu was calm and experienced after all. He would not be flustered by Nangong Lai's series of questions. He turned his head and said to the Emperor, Your Majesty, I've already reported to Your Majesty that I asked the eminent monks to recite the soul-summoning mantra. How can it be considered as lying to Your Majesty? Your Majesty, please uphold justice for me. Indeed, Elder Wu has already explained this matter. The Emperor had always been in a bad mood. He said perfunctorily, I'll lie, you're all my officials. You're all doing this for the peace of the palace. I know all of this. Since Elder Wu has investigated and found nothing wrong, that's naturally the best. There's no need to say anything else. Nangong Lai narrowed his fox-like eyes. There was a hint of mockery in his drooping mouth, but he did not respond. However, Bailey Jiaju opened his mouth slowly. For the peace of the palace, we need sufficient evidence. Elder Wu has slandered my princess consort. Shouldn't you admit your mistake? When he spoke, his posture was no different from usual. He was still tall and graceful, with an unchanging authority and nobility. However, Elder Wu could feel a sense of superiority and absolute disdain from him. This was what he hated the most. The Emperor looked at Elder Wu, then looked at Beligaju's cold face and Nangong Lai's dissatisfaction. He knew that if he did not show some attitude, he would never forget about this. The Imperial Palace calculated the gains and losses in his mind. He changed his mind and pushed Elder Wu out. Since things have escalated to this point, Elder Wu, you should apologize to the juniors. It's not a big deal. Your Majesty. In just a moment, Elder Wu's face changed from being proud to pale. He was the third-generation elder. Everyone present knew about his status and prestige in the War Dragon Empire. Now, His Majesty actually wanted him to bend his waist and apologize to Helian Weiwei, a junior, in front of so many people. This was even more unbearable than killing him. What's wrong? Helian Vivian sat on her seat with her legs slightly crossed. She leaned back leisurely. Elder Wu wants to go against the imperial decree? Elder Wu, the Emperor urged again. His voice was obviously lower than the last time. Elder Wu snatched the cup of tea from the little eunuch's hand and took a deep breath. As he walked toward Helian Weiwei, the muscles on his face were trembling in anger. At this very moment, all he wanted to do was to find a hole and hide in it. Chapter 548. I've misunderstood Princess Consort. It's all my fault. Elder Wu clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It was the first time in his life that he felt so embarrassed. Helian Vivian glanced at him lightly. It's not a misunderstanding. It's a false accusation. It's better for Elder Wu not to accuse people without any evidence in the future. Elder Wu clenched his teeth and said, Yes. Helian Weiwei smiled faintly as she took the teacup from his hand. Instead of drinking, she passed it to the little eunuch at the side. Her thin lips carried a smile as she said, I'll leave it to you. Elder Wu's tea is not that easy to drink. Even though Elder Wu was a person who could keep his composure, his expression turned ugly when he saw Helian Vivian's action. She actually gave the tea that he offered to a eunuch. She was obviously humiliating him. Elder Wu took a deep breath. His hands were hanging by his sides so tight that the veins on the back of his hands could be seen. I'll let her be arrogant for now. When the soldiers enter the palace later, Beligaju will be in a dilemma and be accused of treason. I'd like to see how this Hellion Vivian and the third prince can still be so smug. When Elder Wu thought of this, his shrewd eyes were filled with viciousness. He straightened his back and wanted to retreat. Hold on. Bailey Jiaju's long and narrow eyes looked up and strolled to Wei Wei's side. His tone was neither fast nor slow. Old Wu, when you apologize to the princess consort, you don't need me to teach you how to salute, right? Once again, Elder Wu's expression changed. However, compared to the previous time, this time, it was much more genuine and gloomy. Third brothers. The emperor, who realized what Beligaju wanted to say, reprimanded him in a low voice. Bailey Jiaju did not even look at him. He lowered his eyes and looked down at Elder Wu. His voice was cold, and he only said 2 words, kneel. Third brother. The emperor stood up abruptly. Only then did Bailey Jiaju look up at him with his bright eyes. He still had a faint smile on his face as he said, since ancient times, the imperial family has always been respected. Father, you have allowed Elder Wu to be so unruly. Where is the dignity of our imperial family? Or does father think that the status of the elder courtyard is higher than the imperial family? The emperor narrowed his eyes, then turned around and said to Elder Wu, Elder Wu, third brother is right. You kneel. Your Majesty. Elder Wu still wanted to say something. The emperor didn't listen to him. He just waved his hand, and that was what he meant. If there was anyone in this world who understood the emperor, was the emperor. That was none other than Bailey Jiaju. The emperor's greatest taboo was that the elder courtyard's imposing manner overshadowed the imperial family. What he had always wanted to do was to use both kindness and authority. However much love he could give the elder council, he would restrict them as much as he could, especially in front of the public. Of course, Elder Wu was aware of this. He clearly understood that he could no longer refuse at this point in time. If he refused, it would definitely arouse the emperor's displeasure and suspicion. Then the next part of the plan could not be carried out. Elder Wu bit the meat in his mouth and looked at Beligaju's face. Slowly, he knelt down. Nangong Lai smiled charmingly at the side. He patted Elder Wu's shoulder and said in a low voice, Elder Wu, if I were you, I wouldn't provoke the imperial family like this. The elder courtyard has the guts. However, the scene of being slapped in the face is really TSK, it's so ugly. Elder Wu's eyes darkened. The long sleeves under his fingers were still twisted by his grip. Hellion Vivian was impressed by His Highness's methods. He really wanted to play people to death. Looking at Elder Wu's face, he was so angry that he had probably never knelt before anyone in his life. Following His Highness was like having meat to eat. Seeing that Hellion Vivian was satisfied, Beligaju said coldly, Elder Wu, remember this. If you do it again, it won't be as simple as kneeling. Yes. Elder Wu said the word yes unwillingly. He stood up with a flick of his sleeve and walked back to his seat in big strides. His chest was still rising and falling. Elder Zhan stood beside him and said in a low voice, Elder Wu, I think we should postpone our plan. The imperial family is really difficult to deal with. I'm afraid something will go wrong. No matter how difficult it is to deal with him, he can't escape today. Elder Wu calmed his breath and a cold light flashed in his eyes. As soon as the sound of soldiers and horses is heard, the first person His Majesty will question will be the third prince. Just you wait, this will definitely be a good show. Elder Zhan also wanted to see Beligaju fail miserably. Thinking about it carefully, their plan was foolproof and there was no loophole at all. However, he saw that Hellion Vivian did not show her true colors even though it was clearly a foregone conclusion. Instead, it was Elder Wu who lost face. He could not help but mutter in his heart. However, as Elder Wu said, as soon as the sound of soldiers and horses is heard, no matter whether the third prince sends out his troops or not, he will not end well in the end. He will be treated as a prince guilty of treason by His Majesty and completely lose the right to be the crown prince. As long as he could defeat the third prince, what was a little risk? All right, sit down. After His Majesty finished speaking, he coughed heavily twice. When Eunuch Gao saw this, he immediately handed over a blood-red pill. His Majesty seemed to be very anxious, as if he needed that pill very much. He did not even hide it in front of everyone and directly swallowed it without even drinking water. After that, it was finally smooth. He took a deep breath and said, "Ally, you and Elder Wu are both virtuous ministers of the War Dragon dynasty. In the future, you must be considerate of each other." As he said that, he turned to Elder Wu and asked, "Elder Wu, what's next?" Elder Wu stood up and said in a respectful manner, "Your Majesty, we just need to wait for the eminent monks to finish their rounds of chanting Buddhism and come back. Then, everyone, let's wait in this palace." After His Majesty finished speaking, he glanced at Eunuch Gao. Eunuch Gao raised his voice and shouted, "Serve tea and pastries." In just a moment, the palace maids carrying food plates walked in. Their long dresses reached their ankles, and their steps were light, not daring to make a single mistake. As the chanting of Buddhist scriptures gradually faded away, His Majesty raised the teacup in his hand. The people below responded one after another, drinking tea and eating pastries. Little Seven sat on Hellion Vivian's left side and followed her closely. He was munching on the bean paste bun he brought with him with a very cold expression. "Why aren't you eating?" Hellion Vivian found it strange. This was not the little one's style. Chapter 549. Lil Seven reached out and scratched his little ears. "It's too noisy outside. If I eat now, I'll have to stand up and fight later. I'll eat after the fight is over." As he spoke, he tilted his head and thought for a while. Then he said seriously, "Why don't you wrap them up for me? Otherwise, the snacks will fall off when the fight starts later." As soon as the little one finished his words, there was a commotion outside. The emperor was already angry because of Beligaju's attitude just now. Now, his thick brows furrowed even tighter. "Go and see what's going on outside. Why is it so noisy?"
Yes.
Eunuch Gao left after receiving the order. The two elders sitting in the hall moved their teacups away. They looked at each other and nodded. Hellion Vivian smiled when she saw their actions. Then, she stood up and found an excuse to leave the hall with Lil Seven. Before this, there were already concubines who could leave, and the emperor did not stop them. Therefore, Hellion Vivian did not attract much attention when she left. Elder Wu saw it. However, after the failure of the soul enchanting spell, it did not matter if Hellion Vivian was here or not. It was good that she left. It would save her the trouble of saying anything to help Beligaju. As long as the third prince was in the hall, everything could be done. Elder Wu gulped down a mouthful of tea ferociously. Just wait and see. He would definitely skin Bailey Jiaju alive. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. Bad news. Bad news. Eunuch Gao, who had just walked out of the room, ran back in, panting heavily. The emperor stared at him unhappily. "What's the matter? Why are you in such a panic?" Reporting to Your Majesty. A group of rebels has come in from outside. They have started fighting with the Imperial Guards. Eunuch Gao's forehead was covered with a layer of sweat after he finished speaking. They will break into Chaoyang Hall soon. As soon as Eunuch Gao finished speaking, it was as if the pause button was pressed. In an instant, the palace fell into a deathly silence. The sound of drinking tea and eating snacks completely disappeared. The concubines all froze. Even the emperor was shocked. He was surprised as if he had misheard. "What did you say?" "There's a group of traitors outside the palace." "Shut up." Before Eunuch Gao could finish his words, the emperor interrupted him again. His voice was cold, and his pitch rose sharply. "That's impossible. How can my War Dragon Empire's imperial palace be so easy to attack?" But this was the news he had heard. When Elder Wu saw that everything was going according to his plan, he took a step forward and said, "Your Majesty, since Eunuch Gao said that it's true, it must be true. The noise outside is indeed the sound of weapons killing the enemy." Yes. Eunuch Gao didn't know what to do. He could only nod his head continuously. The emperor narrowed his eyes dangerously. With a wave of his hand, the teacup on the table fell to the ground. Who is it? Who had the guts to do that? Elder Wu lowered his eyes. I don't know who it is, but just like what your majesty said, the imperial palace is so heavily guarded. There are countless palaces, not to mention that the War Dragon Empire's strongest imperial army is guarding the front of Chaoyang Hall. It's impossible to rely on the traitors outside. Under normal circumstances, they would be killed before they could even enter the imperial palace. Since they were able to attack, it can only mean one thing. There's someone in Chaoyang Hall who is cooperating with them from the inside. Elder Wu, you mean? The emperor stood up. His lips were deathly pale, and his entire face looked somewhat gloomy. His eyes swept across the people in the hall one by one, and finally fell on Bailey Jiaju. His eyes narrowed slightly. Someone wants to rebel? Elder Wu answered respectfully. I'm just guessing. After all, it's a big crime to say such a thing. I don't dare to say anything. However, there's one thing that I really want to know. At this point, Elder Wu paused and did not continue. Instead, he glanced at Baligaju. Bailey Jiaju's two slender legs were half-crossed. His expression was still noble and indifferent. His handsome side profile seemed to have been drawn by a brush. It was as if no matter what happened outside, he had no impression of him at all. The emperor was looking at him as well. He retracted his gaze and said to Elder Wu, What's the matter? Elder Wu, just say it. I've heard someone mention it before. They said that they saw someone rushing to make something in the royal palace. The cloth was golden in color and embroidered with dragon claws. Elder Wu raised his head and looked at the emperor as he spoke. Your Majesty, according to the ancestral rules, only your Majesty can wear golden silk. I'm curious. Why would the royal palace rush to make a robe of this color? A golden cloth with dragon claws embroidered on it. It was obvious that they were trying to rebel. The more the emperor listened, the colder his face became. His eyes looked toward Bailey Jiaju. The thick black liquid in his eyes made people feel very uncomfortable. Third brother, how do you explain this matter? It's all nonsense. Baligaju replied calmly. His slender fingers twirled the teacup. He was neither anxious nor impatient, but he gave off a cold vibe. Before the emperor could speak, Elder Wu cut in and began to retreat in order to advance. Perhaps someone saw wrongly, but the people below seemed to be telling the truth. It's inevitable that this old official would want to clarify things and find out the truth. If your Third Highness doesn't mind, this old subject suggests that we send someone to search your Third Highness chambers. This way, not only will we be able to suppress the vile rumors, we can also prove your Third Highness' innocence. Elder Wu, do you know how serious of a crime it is to randomly search a prince's bedroom? Bailey Jiaju asked in a cold voice. Elder Wu was thick-skinned as he shouted, I'm just thinking about your Highness' innocence. Since there's nothing in your Highness's palace, we should investigate further. We'll do as Elder Wu says. The emperor glanced at Baligaju. His voice was so deep that it was almost emotionless. Someone, search the Jiucheng Palace to see if there's the golden robe that Elder Wu mentioned. Yes. The crowd retreated after receiving the order. The sounds of fighting outside the palace were still ringing. The emperor's eyes could not be any darker. Elder Wu was very pleased with himself. He thought that no matter how smart Baligaju was, he would never expect that he had planned everything beforehand. A day ago, he had already gotten someone to hide a set of dragon robes in the Jiucheng Palace. Although it was placed in an inconspicuous position, it could be found easily with a flip of the wrist. He wanted to see what Baligaju's face would look like when the dragon robe was brought over. Chapter 550. The atmosphere in Chaoyang Hall was getting heavier and heavier. The sounds of fighting outside were getting closer and closer. If this had happened in the past, the emperor would have sent the third prince out to prepare for the battle. But today, everyone could feel the emperor's deep distrust towards the third prince. All the ministers and concubines dared not speak. They only lowered their eyes, each with different thoughts in their minds. To be honest, with the third prince's current power, he could have rebelled long ago if he really wanted to. Why would he leave a clue behind and let Elder Wu get a hold of it? Presumably, the emperor also understood this point. It was precisely because the emperor also understood this that he acted like this. No emperor would want to keep a prince who was more popular than him. Therefore, even though Elder Wu was the one who suggested this, the one who really wanted to seize this opportunity and not let the third prince off the hook might be the emperor himself, Elder Wu. The people who went to search returned quickly with joy on their faces. It was obvious that they had gained a lot from this trip to Jiucheng Hall. Elder Wu glanced at Beligaju with a smug look on his face. How is it? Did you find something? That person nodded. We entered the royal study. At first, the shadow guards tried to stop us. We thought they were acting suspiciously, so we barged in. As expected, there was a black package in the secret chamber of the study. They hid it very carefully. Elder Wu had indeed instructed his spies to wrap the fake dragon robe in a black bag so that the other party would not notice it. Now that the black bag was found, it meant that Bailey Jiaju would not be able to make a comeback this time, even if he were to die. Your Highness, shouldn't you explain what's in the black package? Elder Wu's face was full of smiles. Your Highness, please don't tell me that you don't know either. Beligaju glanced at him indifferently. The corner of his mouth seemed to be curled into a mocking smile. Nangong Lai was smart. Although he did not know what exactly was going on, he could tell at a glance that Elder Wu had done something shady. When he looked at Bailey Jiaju, he could not help but reveal a worried look. He did not believe that Aju would hide the dragon robe. Because he knew better than anyone else that with Aju's power, if he couldn't wait and wanted to sit on the throne, he could use any method. There was no need to hide a dragon robe. But this kind of thing couldn't help but be planned in advance. Once the crime of keeping the dragon robe was confirmed, then Aju Nangong Lai's brows wrinkled. For the first time, a ruthless coldness appeared on his unrestrained and bewitching handsome face. The emperor sat on the dragon throne and coughed heavily. His eyes swept over the packages that the imperial bodyguards were carrying. His chest rolled. Good. Third brother, you really are my good son.
Bang.
The sound of another teacup shattering could be heard. However, the teacup brushed past Beligaju's hair and hit the wooden beam behind him. Beligaju's elegant and indifferent handsome face still carried a smile that wasn't a smile. He didn't move, and even his posture was the same as before. Only that pair of long and narrow eyes emitted a sense of oppression. It made the emperor feel frightened. The emperor seemed to have realized that his action was a little overboard. He took a deep breath and stood up from the dragon throne with his whole body trembling. This world will be yours sooner or later. Why are you so anxious? Hiding the dragon robe. I usually spoil you the most, but what about you? Was it also your idea to send in those traitors outside? What are you planning to do? Are you trying to force me to abdicate? Before Beligaju could speak, Elder Wu immediately knelt on the ground. Your Majesty, as a member of the House of Elders, this old official has always been responsible for protecting the country and its people. Since some things have already floated to the surface, this old official has no choice but to say it. Everyone present knows the third prince's attainments in martial arts. All these years, the imperial palace's security has basically been overseen by him. Now that the rebel army is outside and is about to attack, the third prince's shadow guards have not made the slightest movement. The royal family is still standing in Chaoyang Hall, and they don't have any intention to help. From the beginning, I've said that the palace is easy to defend and hard to attack. There are more than 10 palaces. If you want to attack, you must have a detailed and comprehensive plan, otherwise you won't succeed. But today, the rebels were able to sneak through the layers of walls and approach Chaoyang Hall. That can only mean one thing: someone in the palace is working with them from the inside. Now, It seems that the person who is commanding the rebels is undoubtedly the royal family who is most familiar with the inner court of the palace. A bunch of nonsense. Governor Chen couldn't hold it in anymore and stood up. Elder Wu, how can you insist that the royal family is a rebel just based on your own guess? You don't have any evidence and you're just making such a big accusation. If the retired emperor knows about this, do you think he'll let you off so easily? Elder Wu smiled and lifted his chin slightly. Lord Chen, don't use the retired emperor to pressure me. The retired emperor's health isn't good. He just went to the Hidden Spirit Temple, and I'm afraid he won't be back anytime soon. Even if the retired emperor comes back and sees the royal family's treacherous behavior, I don't think he'll help him. He'll only deal with it more decisively. Elder Wu is right. Elder Zhang also stood up, his face full of righteousness. The royal family's crime this time is no small matter. At this stage, Lord Chen is still trying to defend it. Could it be that you're involved in this too? Governor Chen turned around abruptly, his face full of anger. You, all of you, you're slandering me. As he spoke, he cupped his hands. Your Majesty, you must investigate this thoroughly. Your Majesty, please investigate this thoroughly. With Governor Chen as the leader, many ministers knelt on the ground. They wanted the emperor to consider this carefully and not wrongly accuse anyone. However, they didn't know that the more people begged for mercy, the more the emperor wanted to punish Beligaju. He narrowed his eyes slightly as he tightened his grip on the pill in his hand. Since when did the situation in the imperial court come to this stage? Half of the ministers were begging for mercy for the third prince. Did they know who was the real person sitting on the dragon throne? Nangonglai saw the situation and knew that it was not good. As a prodigy priest, he knew the emperor well, if not 100%, he knew at least 70%. The emperor had always been afraid of Aju, whether intentionally or not. He was worried that Aju's limelight would overshadow his. That was why when that happened, he didn't overly suppress the elder compound. It wasn't a good thing for a prince to show his kingly image too early. Aju was too qualified to be the emperor. That was why he was neglected since he was young. Now that so many people were kneeling and begging for mercy for Aju, according to the emperor's character, not only would he not spare Aju, he might even punish him more severely. Chapter 551. At the thought of this, Nangonglai turned around abruptly and glared at Beligaju, who was standing in the middle of the hall. He did not believe that Aju did not understand this. Third brother, these ministers have asked me to spare you. The emperor chuckled softly. The crime of treason is such a serious crime. Tell me, do you think I can spare you? Eunuch Gao was scared out of his wits at this moment. He was trembling as he waited beside the emperor. The emperor had no way to vent his anger on Beligaju. He kicked Eunuch Gao aside and scolded him indirectly. You really can't be tamed no matter how hard you try. Your Majesty. Elder Wu's eyes flickered slightly. Why don't you just bear with it this time, considering that the royal prince is still young? He's still young? The emperor was even angrier. He has the ability to keep the dragon robe for himself. Elder Wu knew that his plan had worked, so he did not say anything else. He just took a step back and could not hide the smile on his face. At this moment, the more people plead for mercy for the third prince, the more horrible his death would be. Everything was going according to his plan. Coupled with the sound of soldiers and horses outside, the emperor's real thoughts could no longer be suppressed. Presumably, even now, the third prince still doesn't understand how he died. That was why one should not always put oneself on a pedestal. Who knew when one would fall from the pedestal, and in such an ugly way? Elder Wu shook his head and pretended to sigh. However, what he did not expect was, just at this time, Bailey Jiaju opened his mouth unhurriedly. His voice was cold and indifferent, carrying a unique ridicule. You've all finished speaking. Isn't it my turn to speak now? Although he used this sentence as a question, his tone was declarative. He stood tall and straight with a smile on his face. It was as if he could give advice to a chess game while talking. Elder Wu, is it because I have been too merciful to the people of the Elder Compound? Is that why you have the guts to frame me? Elder Wu looked up with a pained expression. Royal family. Things have come to this. It's fine if you don't want to admit it, but why do you have to slander me like this? As one of the 4 Grand Elders, I have the responsibility to protect the country. Perhaps the royal family feels that this old official has exposed you in front of the palace, so this old official is guilty beyond redemption. But that is where this old official's conscience lies. If this old official discovers that someone has the intention to rebel, and this old official does not report it to the emperor, then this old official has failed in his duty. Your Highness. I also don't believe that His Highness is such a person. But now that there are both witnesses and material evidence, who can understand the feeling in this old official's heart? It seems that I am still too gentle. Beligaju absent-mindedly turned the silver ring on his finger. Acting in front of me?
Ha!
His laughter was very seductive. It could even be said that it was deep and magnetic. However, the coldness that seeped out from it was enough to make everyone shudder. Elder Wu braced himself and turned his face away. He did not speak to Beligaju anymore. Instead, he spoke to the emperor. Your Majesty, you know very well what kind of thoughts this old official has. The people of the Elder Compound have worked hard for so many years, wholeheartedly for your Majesty, but we are always misunderstood. Now that your Highness thinks of this old official like this, I am really worried that if your Majesty does not punish the royal family this time, he will punish me and my family. Third brother. The emperor's face was completely gloomy. This is the Chaoyang Palace. How dare you be so presumptuous? Do you even respect me, the emperor, as your father? Bailey Jiaju unhurriedly brushed his robe. He was as indifferent and elegant as usual, but his tone was mixed with a kind of indescribable mockery. Father, aren't you a little too anxious to condemn me so quickly? Hearing this, the emperor's eyes narrowed dangerously. Elder Wu immediately continued the topic. The royal family, the dragon robe has been found. What else do you have to say? Dragon robe? Beligaju looked down at the black package on the ground. Just based on this? Elder Wu steadied his tone. It seems that your Highness will not give up until the royal family sees it for themselves. Guards, open this black package. Yes. One of the 2 bodyguards answered and bowed. Elder Wu raised his chin proudly, waiting to see how Beligaju would be rendered speechless. However, he heard a commotion. What is that? It looks like beef jerky. There should be candied dates too, right? Beef jerky. Candied dates. Elder Wu seemed to have realized something. He lowered his head and looked at the snacks scattered all over the ground after the black package was opened. His dark brown eyes shook back and forth. This is impossible. How could this be? This is impossible. He was the one who put the item away. How could a dragon robe turn into a pile of beef jerky out of nowhere? This black package was obviously the one that he ordered someone to hide in the Jiucheng Hall. Could it be? Elder Wu suddenly raised his eyes and looked at Beligaju's face with a pale face. It's him. It must be him. The person who hid the item was found out by him. He took advantage of the situation and changed the dragon robe inside. But why didn't he say that it was filled with snacks from the start? Moreover, he did not punish the person who hid the dragon robe. He even left that person to report to him. Elder Wu did not know why, but he began to feel extremely uneasy. The pride he had just now almost collapsed in an instant. He looked at the man standing in front of him. He had been like this from beginning to end. When he looked at him, it was as if he was looking at a clown who couldn't stand on the stage. This made Elder Wu feel an unprecedented chill. He could not help but take a few steps back. The expression on his face was numb. The emperor was stunned as well. He then frowned. Beligaju smiled faintly and picked up a piece of beef jerky. His long fingers that were wearing a black glove crushed it little by little, but his posture was elegant and handsome. What's wrong? Elder Wu seems to be very disappointed. Coincidentally, I wanted to ask Elder Wu about the snacks that I was planning to give to Little Seven. Elder Wu did not even open it to take a look. How could you be so sure that it contained the dragon robe? Elder Wu could not hold his ground with such a question. There was an uproar in the palace. Everyone looked at Elder Wu with a deep sense of inquiry. Elder Wu gritted his teeth and tried to keep his mind clear. There was still a chance. He had not completely failed. As long as the commotion outside the palace was still there, he had not lost. Since he had chosen not to send the army, even if the dragon robe was not a success, Beligaju would not be able to escape from this rebellion. Let's see what I have to say next. Chapter 552. Your Majesty, I have indeed seen a yellow brocade robe in Jiucheng Hall. However, I don't understand why the robe in the package was replaced with beef jerky. Please investigate further, Your Majesty. At this point, Elder Wu knew that there was no turning back for him. He might as well accuse Beligaju, Your Majesty. The sounds of soldiers and horses outside were still ringing out. At such a critical moment, the third prince had been standing in the hall without any intention of sending out troops to stop them. The evidence that this old official had found with great difficulty had been replaced by these snacks by some unknown person. Your Majesty, with all these matters laid out before us, I'm sure you have an idea of what's going on. The emperor pressed his left hand on the armrest of the throne and did not speak. However, when he looked at Beligaju, his suspicion did not disappear at all. The tone of Bailey Jiaju's voice was particularly slow. Elder Wu's ability to turn the tables is really profound. You said that your men saw a yellow brocade robe in Jiucheng Hall. Huh. Elder Wu, do you need me to remind you that the Elder Compound is in the west of the city, while Jiucheng Hall is in a corner of the palace? How did your men see through Jiucheng Hall through so many palaces? Upon hearing that, everyone turned to look at Elder Wu. Elder Wu's face turned pale, and he wanted to explain. Bailey Jiaju interrupted him coldly. How dare you plant your own spy in the prince's bedroom? Elder Wu, you're really bold. How dare you put your men around me? Don't forget where you are now. This is the palace. Or is it that Elder Wu is not afraid of the royal family's authority and the country's laws at all? You can put your men around whoever you want. What about the emperor and the retired emperor? Did you plant your own men there too? The emperor narrowed his eyes. When he looked at Elder Wu, he suppressed his aura. Elder Wu shouted, I'm innocent. As a senior official of 3 generations, I know what to do and what not to do. I only got the news about the yellow robe in Jiucheng Hall by chance. I didn't mean to pry into it. Even if I had 100 guts, I wouldn't dare to interfere with the royal family's affairs. The royal family is so concerned because of this news, Your Majesty. Ju, I'll give you one last chance. The emperor walked over and fixed his gaze on the black package. He said in a deep voice, Tell me, what was originally in this package? Beligaju raised his eyebrows coldly. Father, it's irrelevant to ask me these questions. Why don't you ask Elder Wu, what is the punishment for framing a prince for a rebellion? Royal family. Elder Wu cried out loudly, as if he expected better from His Highness. His Majesty was kind enough to give you a chance, but Your Highness did not cherish it. Why would I frame you? This is the truth. Otherwise, Your Highness, how are you going to explain why you didn't send troops to defend against the rebels outside the palace? Beligaju raised his head and looked at Elder Wu with his calm eyes. Then, his thin lips curled into a unique smile. Although the corners of his lips were curled up elegantly, it gave people an endless sense of coldness. Who said that I didn't defend against the rebels outside the palace?
What did he mean by that?
Elder Wu's body froze. His heart skipped a beat, and his legs started to give way. Impossible. This is absolutely impossible. He had been standing in Chaoyang Hall since the beginning. How could he mobilize the troops? But for some reason he still felt a deep sense of unease. Elder Wu had just lowered his eyes. Then, a loud bang sounded from outside. It was as if something had exploded. Even though he was standing in the hall, he could see the smoke rising to the sky. Elder Wu turned his head around abruptly, but before he could say anything, he was interrupted.
Pung.
The second loud bang pierced through the sky. Bailey Jiaju stood in the midst of the smoke and confusion, with a smile on his face. All the brilliance was reflected in his eyes, like a broken diamond, so sharp that it could almost cut through people's hearts. Report. The leader of the Imperial Army rushed in and knelt on one knee. He cupped his fists and said, "Your Majesty, reinforcements have arrived. The reinforcements have surrounded all the rebels. The rebels have nowhere else to go. It's only a matter of time before they die." "Is there really reinforcements?" Elder Wu's eyes widened. His body trembled, and his lips turned extremely pale. "No, I can't panic. Besides, there's nothing to panic about. Since the third prince has sent troops, I'll use the second plan. Although it was not as successful as the first plan, it could still kill Baligaju." The rebellion in the palace was suppressed. The emperor finally heaved a sigh of relief, but at the same time, he felt conflicted. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Where did the reinforcements come from?" I don't know." The leader of the Imperial Army hesitated. He looked at Baligaju and said, "But from the looks of it, they should be here for the royal family's sake." The emperor frowned. "What do you mean by, for the royal family? Don't you know what kind of military flag the reinforcements are flying?" This official. The leader of the Imperial Army did not know how to explain it to the emperor. The reinforcements were very efficient. They were like a gust of wind. Wherever they went, they would fight. There were not many of them, and each of them was carrying a strange weapon. They could fight against more than a dozen of them with just one hit. The most important thing was that they did not have a military flag. So, until now, he did not know where the reinforcements came from. Elder Wu seized the opportunity and said, "Your Majesty, you won't be able to get anything out of Chief Zhang. The closest army to the palace is your city-guarding army. Chief Zhang said that the reinforcements are here for the royal family's sake." This is the first time I've heard that a prince has the right to mobilize the city-guarding army before he ascends the throne. The more this old official looks at the third prince's matter, the more alarmed this old official is. Even the city guards are under his control. Presumably, this old official does not need to say much, but Your Majesty can see through the situation. Should I say that the third prince gave himself away in order to protect himself? Elder Wu turned his head and looked into Baligaju's eyes. "Royal family, how did you get the city-guarding army to work for you? Shouldn't you explain it clearly?" Nangong Lai finally understood Elder Wu's insidiousness. Whether Ju sent the reinforcements or not, Elder Wu would have an explanation for this rebellion. The city-guarding army was a reserve army that only the emperor had the right to mobilize. Even the retired emperor could not touch it, not to mention a prince with a sensitive identity. Once the city-guarding army was mobilized, the prince would be finished. Chapter 553. Why isn't the royal family saying anything? Elder Wu pressed on. "Do you not know how to explain?" Bailey Jiaju lowered his head. His hair covered his pair of long and narrow eyes, faintly emitting a cold light. Elder Wu saw him like this and thought that he had nothing to say.
He was about to say something.
Then, a loud bang was heard. The door of Chaoyang Hall was kicked open. The person was carrying something that looked like a long black pipe. Her legs were long and slender, and she had a smile on her face. Her skin was fair and beautiful. Who else could it be other than Hellion Vivian? The corners of her mouth were half curled as she leaned against the side of the door, standing not far away from Bailey Jiaju. Her eyes were filled with mockery as she said, "Elder Wu, who told you that we are the city guards?" You. Elder Wu did not expect Hellion Vivian to come back in this way. He thought that she had returned to Jiucheng Palace because she was not feeling well. Hellion Vivian put her finger between her lips. Her action was very handsome, and a loud whistle was heard. More than 10 black figures landed one after another. Their actions were uniform, but each had their own unique characteristics. Their figures were all 1 in 100. Some were muscular, some were handsome, and some had smiles on their faces. Their arms and wrists were wrapped in white bandages, and each of them was holding machine guns and sniper cannons. Their aura was extraordinary, and there was a strong murderous aura in their cool manner. The leader of the Imperial Guards exclaimed and pointed at those people, "Your Majesty, it's them. It's these 20 people who blocked the rebel army's escape route." Just 20 or so people were able to stop the ferocious rebel army? This was impossible, right? How did they do it? Everyone could not help but look at that row of people with indescribable interest in their eyes.
All right.
Hellion Vivian walked to Beligaju's side and smiled at Elder Wu. Her posture was indescribably domineering. "Tell Elder Wu and the Emperor who you are." "Yes," they replied in unison, shaking the entire Morning Sun Hall. "We are from the Hellion Residence, the hidden army that protects the country."
What?
The hidden army? Elder Wu took a heavy step back. It was as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water on him, drenching him from head to toe. He was extremely cold. Everyone stood up with a boom, their eyes filled with shock. There was no one present who did not know about the legend of the hidden army. How many people had dreamt of seeing the most valiant army in the history of the War Dragon Empire? However, following the passing of Old Master Hellion, the hidden army seemed to have disappeared as well. Some time ago, someone said that Hellion Vivian had been recognized by the hidden army. However, they couldn't help but have doubts in their hearts. After all, they hadn't seen it before. Since they hadn't seen it before, everything was just a rumor.
But now,
the hidden army had really appeared. "Your Majesty." Hellion Vivian's thin lips curled. "In this case, you have no reason to suspect the royal family." He didn't use any city guards, but ordered the hidden army to guard the palace and protect your safety. After all, with so many eminent monks entering the palace, it was inevitable that someone would take this opportunity to create trouble. Unfortunately, Your Majesty didn't trust His Highness, nor did you trust me. You allowed Elder Wu to slander you. It was inevitable that our actions were slow, which gave the rebel army a chance to breathe. Your Majesty is so righteous. You won't blame us for being late to rescue you, right? Hellion Weiwei's words made the Emperor feel as if he was choking. Every word was like a slap to his face. However, he couldn't lose his temper, because there was no emperor who would flare up at a person who had done meritorious deeds in front of everyone. Not only would he be despised by everyone, but it would also be recorded in the history books. He couldn't let himself be branded as a fatuous ruler. Therefore, even if the emperor's face was not looking good, he could only endure it. He gripped the handle of a chair tightly and forced a generous smile on his face. "Eunuch Gao." "Yes, Your Majesty." Eunuch Gao could no longer understand the emperor's temper. He shuddered when he heard the emperor's voice. The emperor looked at Hellion Vivian and tightened his grip. "Pass down my order. The third princess Consort is meritorious in rescuing the emperor. She will be rewarded handsomely." "Yes, Your Majesty." Eunuch Gao lowered his eyes and retreated. Hellion Vivian smiled. "Your Majesty, don't be in a hurry to reward me. Elder Wu's crime of slandering the prince has not been punished yet." Hearing this, the smile on the emperor's face completely disappeared. He looked at Hellion Vivian without saying a word, but he was obviously displeased. As smart as Hellion Vivian was, how could she not know how much her attitude had offended the emperor? However, this was her temper. She was very protective of her children. As a father, he couldn't wait for his son to be labeled as a traitor so that he could protect his throne and reputation. A father like him didn't deserve to be a human. Beligaju probably felt that her little face was too cynical. He reached out to pull her back and said in a low voice, "Vivian." Hellion Vivian glanced at him and comforted him. "Don't worry, I'm here. No one can bully you." He wanted to say that he would take care of the rest. If he did it, he would make others feel worse than death. However, His Highness was shameless. He was very good at following Hellion Vivian's words. His tone was a little softer, as if he was sighing, "I've never been favored since I was young. I'm used to things like today. It's just that I feel a little sad. Can you accompany me for a drink tonight?" "Okay." Hellion Vivian naturally agreed. Not to mention drinking wine, she could even brew wine for His Highness. But don't feel too bad. Our Queen Wei Wei had always been weak when it came to comforting people. She could only let His Highness hold her and lean on her with most of his strength. Her shoulders were still trembling. Hellion Vivian thought that he was feeling very bad, so she stiffened and comforted him. However, she didn't know that His Highness was already grinning from ear to ear. His expression was very cunning. Nangong Lai was close to the two of them. Naturally, he saw the whole process clearly. The corner of his mouth was twitching from the beginning to the end. Even if they were brothers who grew up together, he couldn't help but say something. Ju is really shameless. So, this elder, Wu, must be out of his mind. Of all people, why did he have to frame Ju? His worries disappeared and Nangong Lai returned to his usual demonic charm. He waved his white feathered fan and looked at Elder Wu, who was already stiff. Beligaju also looked up at this moment. His gaze was as calm as water and even had a wicked smile. However, it made Elder Wu feel like he was better off dead. It's over. This time, even the Emperor wouldn't be able to protect him. Chapter 554. How dare you? The Emperor was still maintaining the bearing of a king, but after he uttered those two words, he started coughing violently. It was not because of anything else, but because the person standing in front of him was Beligaju. That was the son that he had always been afraid of. He only looked at him, without saying a word. But it reminded the Emperor of 7 years ago, when Bailey Jiaju was not yet an adult. He had just survived a big fire and stood in the depths of the eerie palace. His left eye was wrapped in gauze as he looked at the Emperor. He looked down at him with a murderous aura. He could not imagine that was the gaze of a child. That was why he could not get close to this child. Because no one knew better than him the viciousness and cruelty in his third son's bones. Such a person would sooner or later usurp his throne. The Emperor narrowed his eyes, but he had no choice but to swallow his anger. He knew better than anyone else that this son of his was not to be trifled with. It was because he understood that he had the intention to get rid of him. However, to get rid of him, this was not the right time to do so. There were rebels on the outside, and ministers on the inside. This was not a good time at all. The Emperor lowered his eyes and glanced at Elder Wu, who had lost his soul. He waved his sleeve and said, "Elder Wu, you're on your own now." He did not seem to want to listen to Elder Wu anymore because no matter what he said, it was no doubt a reminder to him that his dignity as a king was severely damaged this time. What's next? After all, Eunuch Gao had been the Emperor's servant for many years. He could guess the Emperor's intention accurately and knew how to give the Emperor a way out. The Emperor strode forward and said, "Everything will be dealt with by the third prince." He then disappeared in front of the palace door, leaving only a trace of anger. However, that bit of anger did not affect Bailey Jiaju at all. He slowly turned the silver ring in his hand and slowly walked towards Elder Wu.
Thump.
Elder Wu could no longer withstand the chill that gushed out from the bottom of his heart. He fell to his knees on the ground, sweating profusely, while his hands trembled violently. However, he still could not understand how he had lost. As if he had seen through his thoughts, Bailey Jiaju reached out his hand and grabbed his collar. Then, he lifted him up and said in a low voice that only the two of them could hear, "Do you think it's so easy to open the door of the palace? You. How could he know?"
No.
He clearly knew about it. So why did he allow them to attack the palace?
Why?
Why is this happening? He could have stopped them from the very beginning. Bailey Jiaju curved his thin lips into a smile.
Why?
You made a move against so many eminent monks in an attempt to snatch away my most beloved prey, only to be defeated. How can such a small lesson be enough? Also, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, what does this have to do with you? Elder Wu was getting more and more confused. He could not understand what benefits this person would gain by making such a big fuss. Beligaju looked up indifferently. It doesn't matter. I just wanted to teach him a lesson, as the emperor. Otherwise, do you think you could have barged into the palace with your abilities? The one you really want to deal with is... Elder Wu's eyes gradually widened. However, before he could finish his sentence, his chest churned and he vomited blood out of anger. How could he accept this? Everything that he had planned so meticulously was merely a chess piece that the other party had used to attack him. Speaking of which, I have to thank Elder Wu. His Highness had always been a black-bellied person. His thin lips curled up. If it wasn't for Elder Wu, I would have to consider the rules and reputation even if I wanted to teach my father a lesson. Although I don't care what the world says about me, someone does. I don't want to be a demon whose hands are stained with blood in that person's eyes. This way, it can't be better. With Elder Wu's cooperation, those who deserve to be taught a lesson will be taught a lesson, and those who deserve to die will be torn into pieces. However, I would like to tell you one thing, Elder Wu. After so long, I have never seen anyone as foolish as you.
You.
Elder Wu pointed at Beligaju with a trembling finger. He looked like he was about to die from a heart attack. Beligaju straightened his body. He was as noble and sharp as a blade.
Take him away.
It was just 3 simple words, but it carried the aura of commanding the world. The Shadow Guard replied, yes. Elder Jean, who had been watching from the sidelines for a long time, finally regained his senses. He watched helplessly as his colleague was dragged away. His heart was filled with intense fear, and until now, he couldn't say a single word. Elder Jean started to feel lucky that he only agreed to Elder Wu's suggestion and did not participate in it. If he had participated, then the consequences. Elder Jean did not dare to continue thinking. He lowered his eyes and wanted to hide himself in the crowd. However, what made his fingers stop was that Beligaju actually walked to his side and stopped. He did not know if it was intentional or not. At that moment, Elder Jean's scalp went numb. However, Beligaju only smiled evilly and walked past him. Elder Jean. Was His Highness deliberately scaring him just now?
Ah.
Don't play with people like this. Hellion Vivian turned around. Her delicate face was filled with curiosity. What did you say to Elder Wu just now? Why is he so angry? Nothing much. Beligaju pulled her over and put her beside him. I just kindly gave him some advice on how to play chess. Hellion Vivian raised her eyebrows. You're teaching him chess at this time? He asked me. Beligaju's expression was very innocent. Did Elder Wu have such good taste? Hellion Vivian was very suspicious. However, the matter was resolved satisfactorily. She did not need to use the thing in her hand anymore. She lowered her head and passed the sniper rifle to Little Seven, who was holding a bean bun in his mouth. The little one caught it with ease, turned around, and aimed the sniper cannon at Nangong Lai, who had snatched his red bean bun. Nangong Lai's originally charming smile froze. He immediately jumped up.
Hey.
Little Seven, what are you doing? You can't just point that thing at someone.
Damn.
You're really going to hit him. Ju. Hurry up and stop him. This crazy foodie. No one could stop the little 7th prince from having fun chasing after Nangong Lai with his long spear. The little one was particularly ferocious when it came to fighting. Even if a group of eunuchs followed behind him, it was useless. Since ancient times, the little 7th prince only listened to the royal family. Chapter 555. Little 7, watch how you hit him. Don't damage the palace. Beligaju's voice was heard faintly. Hearing this, Nangong Lai shouted, Ju, are you kidding me? He's hitting me now, not the palace. Don't teach your child like that. Sooner or later, he'll become a naughty child. Hearing this, Beligaju looked up. Little 7, he snatched the red bean bun that 3rd aunt made for me. The little one stopped what he was doing and turned around. He pouted and complained with his cheeks puffed up. Baligaju looked at the dumbfounded Nangon Lai and said, "Hit him slowly. Don't kill him. Let him pay for your red bean bun."
All right.
The little one nodded solemnly. He turned his head around and continued to fight. Helian Weiwei watched from the side with great interest as the onlookers enjoyed the show. Seeing that the crisis in Chaoyang Hall had been resolved, Baligaju brought a few shadow guards to interrogate Elder Wu personally. He wanted to ask who was the mastermind behind this conspiracy. However, after he left, Elder Ming, who was hiding in the dark, stuck out his scarlet tongue and licked his thin lips. Helian Vivian shifted her legs and looked behind her. Xiao Bai raised his eyebrows. "Weiwei, what's wrong?" "Nothing," Helian Vivian said, but when she walked back to her bedroom, she was twice as alert as usual. The chanting of the eminent monks had stopped earlier. After Helian Vivian walked out of Chaoyang Hall, the entire palace was unusually quiet. Helian Vivian slowed down her footsteps. Although there were not many guards on this road, she would always meet many palace maids and eunuchs. However, why were there so few people on this road today? Could it be because of the palace coup that Elder Wu started?
No.
Something was still not quite right. Just as Helian Weiwei was about to stop, a row of palace maids suddenly appeared in front of her. The palace maids' walking posture was a little strange. They were not as respectful as usual and appeared to be somewhat sluggish. Even when they took a step, they were very sluggish, as if they were puppets being led by someone. Their whole body exuded a strange aura. Helian Vivian narrowed her eyes, her fingers subconsciously pressed on the dagger at her waist. The palace maids walked over slowly, not even turning their heads. However, every one of them was dripping wet, as if they had just been fished out of the water. They lowered their heads and let their hair down. When they saw Helian Vivian, they did not greet her, as if she was not in front of them. But Helian Weiwei couldn't pretend that they didn't exist, because all of this was too horrifying. A sound came from the side of his ear. Helian Weiwei looked in the direction of the sound and saw that every palace maid's feet were tied with iron chains. The chains were so black that they could not be seen clearly if one was not close enough. Just looking at them would make one feel uncomfortable. The reason why they were in a row was because of the iron chains in the middle. Since when was there such a punishment in the palace? Moreover, why was there no eunuch leading them to receive the punishment? Helian Vivian furrowed her brows the more she thought about it. She wanted to take a closer look, but she felt dizzy, followed by drowsiness. A fair and well-defined hand reached out and caught her limp body. His white sleeve was filled with the fragrance of medicine. He smiled gently and looked at Helian Vivian's face with gentleness. "You're very vigilant. I have to do it myself." "Master, this subordinate." Elder Ming did not have the posture he had in front of others. His hands were on the ground, and his scarlet eyes looked at the man who appeared in front of him. The man was dressed in a white robe. His handsome face was as white as jade, rare in the world. However, he had been ill since young, so it was inevitable that he would cough when he spoke. "It's not your fault." Her ability has always been very strong. If it was not because of the change in the palace, even I would not be able to get close to her. Now, we only need to wait until midnight. "Yes, master." Elder Ming respectfully bowed his head and lowered his eyes. Helian Vivian, who was in deep sleep, was still in the previous scene. She walked forward in a daze. "Don't go any further." Yuan Ming's voice came from the Xuanhuan space, with a rare sense of urgency. Helian Vivian's eyes shook, as if they were clear. "Yuan Ming, why are you so agitated?" "I'm agitated?" Yuan Ming's eyes were serious. "Look at what's in front of you first." Helian Vivian heard this and lowered her head. Even if she was calm, it was inevitable that she would be shocked by the scene in front of her. It was a deep black river. What grew in it was not water plants but corpses. Even her surroundings were pitch black. Other than the weak light, she could not see anything else. Further ahead was an endless mandara flower. When the wind blew, it was red and intoxicating. She could faintly hear the clanging sound. It was a kind of flirtatious beauty. Red vegetation was not something that could be seen everywhere. But the mandara flower here had spread to the entire river. Hellion Vivian raised her eyebrows and turned around. Only then did she see a tombstone. There were only 2 words engraved on the tombstone. It was very messy, but it was full of killing intent. The underworld. The underworld? What's going on? Even if she did not read many books, she knew what kind of place the underworld was. Wasn't that the legendary hell, the place where thousands of ghosts gathered? Why was she here? Yuan Ming's eyes darkened. Someone set up a barrier in the palace and used the resentment of the palace to bring you in. The palace mates you saw just now were the ones who died in the palace before. They were used to lead the way. It turned out that the other party did not want to use the eminent monk to take your soul. Instead, he wanted to use the underworld to achieve the method of soul exchange. The soul-sucking spell was just the beginning. This method is really good. While everyone's attention was on the palace rebellion, he made a move.
You said so much.
How can we get out? Hellion Vivian pulled the iron chain next to her and restored her usual shrewdness. If you can come in, you should be able to go out. With your ability as the devil's messenger, this method should not be difficult for you. Yuan Ming's voice was low. It is not difficult for me, but we have to make sure that the next person has no other movement. According to my speculation, he should be using the 7 stars soul guidance array. This array needs to wait until midnight to completely exchange your soul. Now we still have time. However, as far as the current situation is concerned, the success rate is very small.
Why?
Hellion Vivian's eyes narrowed. Yuan Ming's face had a bloodthirsty look. Not everyone can use the 7 stars soul guidance array. Logically speaking, this array was lost 100 years ago. Now that it has reappeared in the world, this person must be the best of the exorcising tribe. Since such a person set up the array, it will not be discovered. At that time, no one will extinguish his soul exchange lamp. Even if we can safely get out of here, you will not be able to return to your physical body. Chapter 556. When Hellion Vivian heard this, her fingers froze for a moment. She had a premonition that she would leave that body one day. When the Hellion Vivian in her dream asked her to return the body again and again, she had a faint uneasiness in her heart. But she had never thought that all of this would happen so quickly. She had just promised Beligaju that she would accompany him for a drink. She had never thought that she would be in hell in the blink of an eye. Hellion Vivian looked around and said in a firm and cold voice, "No matter what, let's get out of here first." She had never liked to break an appointment with someone. Moreover, what she didn't want to see the most was that person's disappointment. Because he was too strong. Living in the darkness, he had always been expressionless. There was calculation in his eyes. Even when he was angry, he would only smile elegantly and evilly. He always made people feel that he was indestructible. But Hellion Vivian knew that he would also be unhappy. When he was unhappy, he would always smile very hard. For example, when he was suspected and plotted against by his biological father in the main hall today, so she had to get out of here no matter what. Wei Wei, you must remember, if someone asks you to drink soup later, you must not drink it. If you go to the wrong place, turn around and walk with your back turned. Yuan Ming lowered his voice and reminded her, the most important thing is not to let people find out that you are a living creature. Hellion Wei Wei nodded and turned sideways to pass through a door. What entered her sight was Oxhead and Horseface leading groups of people toward the arch bridge. That bridge was made of stone. It looked very ordinary, but compared to the human world, it was abnormally dark. The people walking on the bridge were all wearing long robes. There were no chains on their hands and feet, but there was no expression on their faces. They were like wandering ghosts. All of them were expressionless. At the beginning of the bridge, there was a person dressed like an old woman with her back bent. She was holding a bowl in her hand. She couldn't see what she looked like, but she was carrying bowls of soup. It's Meng Pe. Yuan Ming lowered his eyes slightly. Don't go there. If someone sees you, they will make you drink soup to cross the bridge. Once you cross the bridge and enter the reincarnation path, you can't really go back. From now on, avoid their eyes and walk to your right. There should be a judgment hall there. On the first floor of the judgment hall, There is an exit to the human world. Hellion Vivian followed Yuan Ming's instructions and tried her best to hide in the dark. This was easy for her. It was not because of anything else, but because the undead in hell all had their eyes fixed in front of them and would not shift their gazes. This gave Hellion Vivian a very good opportunity to dodge. The ones he really had to be wary of were the Oxhead and Horseface. Their eyes had never been idle from the beginning to the end. Their eyes were flowing with a demonic red as they looked around. They didn't forget to talk and chatter. No one knew what they were talking about. They're speaking in ghost language. Yuan Ming listened carefully. The person who wants to take your soul used a formation to blur the boundary between the underworld and the human world. This has unknowingly increased their workload by a lot. Hellion Vivian retracted her gaze and said in a faint tone, "It shouldn't be that simple." They seemed to be very irritable. All right, other than blurring the boundaries, that person seems to want to open the gates of hell and release all the heinous ghosts in the 18 levels of hell. Yuan Ming smiled evilly. It's really a bold and interesting idea. What's more interesting is that there's your help in this. Hellion Vivian's shapely eyebrows slightly raised. My help? The exorcism seal that was branded in the divine land can only be undone by the blood of the exorcism successor, which is your blood. Yuan Ming's tone was still evil. Don't underestimate your blood. If you use it well, you can really knock open the gates of hell. Hellion Vivian narrowed her eyes. It's my own will. I don't want to encounter ghosts while walking up there. It's very clear that your own will is not important. Yuan Ming floated 2 steps forward and almost collided with an oxhead who was escorting a vengeful spirit. Fortunately, Hellion Weiwei's speed was fast enough, and she pulled him back. That oxhead was not easy to fool. He turned around and looked into the dark cave. The human and demon hiding in the dark held their breaths. That bull's head moved its strange pair of eyes and slowly approached them. What's wrong? Standing beside him, Horseface reached out to stop him. Oxhead did not say anything. He pulled out his blade and stabbed in Hellion Vivian's direction twice, but there was no effect. Only then did he reply gloomily, "Nothing. I thought someone came in. Who dares to barge into the underworld?" Horseface smiled disapprovingly. Oxhead licked his lips. If someone really did come in, they can be our dinner. Stop dreaming and continue working. Today, the little king of hell has a belly full of anger. If we don't send these vengeful spirits back to their original positions, you and I will not have a good time. Horseface threw down this sentence and left with the chains. Oxhead was still hesitating. He circled around the dark cave once more before leaving. It was only then that Hellion Weiwei walked out and resumed her normal breathing. According to Yuan Ming, Oxhead and Horseface did not have any effect on humans. However, when it came to spirits, regardless of whether they were living or dead, once they met their eyes, they would involuntarily follow them. This was also why Oxhead and Horseface were in charge of capturing souls when people were about to die. They finally passed through this dangerous situation without any danger. When they walked to the far right, the bridge of helplessness was no longer there. Their vision became clearer and clearer. The stone walls were lit with torches, and their shadows were cast on the ground, somewhat drifting. That's the first trial hall. However, it's still a bit difficult to get there. It was unknown if it was because they were in hell, but even Yuan Ming's voice was a little shaky. Hellion Vivian nimbly stuck to the wall and stuck her head out. Her eyes sized up a huge creature not far away. From afar, that huge creature looked like a ferocious-looking large dog, like a Tibetan Mastiff. Hellion Vivian loved canines the most, but she could not bring herself to love this one. This was because it had 2 heads, each with a different expression and slightly exposed fangs. They had eyes as red as magma, hair like tides, and a pungent smell similar to sulfuric acid. This is the legendary hellhound. Hellion Vivian narrowed her eyes. Yuan Ming glanced back and said with some surprise, "How did you know?" It was written in the books that they are the guardians of hell. They will appear at night and eat the corpses that have just been buried. If a living person sees them, they will mysteriously die the next day. Helly and Vivian's lips curled up. I never thought that such a creature would actually exist. Chapter 557. Yuan Ming looked into the distance. Behind it is the passageway to the human world. You need to subdue it first. You need to be as quiet as possible so that you don't alarm the person who raised it. The person who raised it really needs to consider the aesthetics of the person who raised it. Helly and Vivian also had a pet in the modern world. The one that followed her was a purebred Tibetan Mastiff. However, the one in her family was much more handsome than this one. At the very least, it wouldn't drool while sleeping. However, this was also the most difficult thing for Helly and Vivian to overcome. The two-headed dog meant that they wouldn't give her any chance to slip past. Because even if one of them was sleeping, the other would be awake. Yuan Ming, of course, knew the difficulty of this. His tone carried a hint of playfulness. Woman, what do you plan to do this time? You can't sneak away. If I can't sneak away, I'll face it head-on. Helly and Vivian smiled. Have you ever heard of the story of dual personality? Yuan Ming was still puzzled when he saw her take a step forward. She walked past the stone wall and stood in front of the two-headed dog without any fear. Almost instantly, the awake dog had immediately turned around. Its scarlet eyes stared at Helly and Vivian and let out a low growl. What a fragrant smell. It's been a long time since I smelled such a fragrant smell. As it spoke, it walked towards Helly and Vivian. The other dog head that was sleeping soundly opened its eyes. Hey, what are you doing? Don't you know I'm sleeping? There's a human here. She smells delicious. Human? The sleeping dog head also stood up. It looked at Helly and Vivian with shining eyes. It looked like it hadn't eaten meat in 800 years. Doesn't she smell great? We'll split it in half. The other dog head was somewhat impatient. At this moment, Helly and Wei Wei laughed. Do you really want to split it in half? Then the one that eats my upper body is lucky. My upper body has more meat. I'll eat the upper body. The two dog heads spoke at the same time. After saying that, they looked at each other with an imposing manner. I was the one who found her, so I should be the one to eat her first. You can eat first and leave the upper half of your body for me. The two dog heads finally met. Their eyes met, and sparks flew. Helly and Vivian smiled quietly. She wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to go around. However, she did not expect that at this moment, a frivolous voice sounded from behind her. That voice still sounded a little immature, but there was an indescribable coldness in it. First dog, second dog, you guys are really stupid. You don't even know that you've been tricked. Helly and Vivian turned around and looked at the intersection of light and shadow. It was a 5-year-old boy with delicate features. Helly and Vivian had seen so many children, but she had never seen one like him. He was so delicate that one look and she knew that this guy would definitely grow up to be a troublemaker. The main reason was that he now exuded the aura of, I want to woo all the beauties in the world. He had a pacifier in his mouth, a string of bones around his neck, and a huge axe in his hand. The axe was much bigger than him, but he carried it on his shoulder without any sense of awkwardness. He looked at Helly and Wei Wei, narrowed his eyes, bent his nose, and sniffed around. Suddenly, he smiled viciously and said, Interesting, a living creature that still has the scent of a human. No wonder first dog and second dog are so greedy. Are you going to feed yourself to them, or do you want me to beat you into oblivion? Helly and Vivian was a pedophile. She couldn't bear to see such a cool little boy. She didn't care what he said and directly carried him up. She ruffled his black hair and said, Why do you have a pair of bat wings on your back? Those are not bat wings. The little boy was furious. He took a deep breath and said, You put me down first. Helly and Vivian let go of him. The little boy immediately took out a small mirror from his clothes and looked left and right. Then he sighed and said, Fortunately, I'm not messed up. I'm still as handsome as ever. Helly and Vivian's mouth twitched twice. Were children nowadays so narcissistic? Hey, you. The little boy leaned on the two-headed dog and crossed his legs. How did you get in? Helly and Vivian said calmly, It said that someone set up a formation. I was tricked into coming in. Formation? The little boy's amber eyes narrowed. He looked at her and suddenly smiled. So, you're the descendant of the exorcist tribe? But if I'm not wrong, you're obviously from the 21st century. How did you appear in ancient times? Hearing the last sentence, Hellion Vivian suddenly raised her eyes. Then, she returned to her usual roguish self. This question, I also want to ask you, the law enforcers of the underworld. Why did you let me go to ancient times? Well, the little boy rubbed his chin with his fingers. I'll have to investigate this carefully to see if there's a mistake somewhere. Hellion Vivian smiled and said, No need. I think ancient times are pretty good. Is that so? The little boy smiled again, full of bloodthirst. I haven't agreed to let you go yet. Why did you choose where you want to go? Even if you're the descendant of the exorcist tribe, you should pay a price for teasing my first dog and second dog. Hellion Vivian raised her eyebrows. I thought that a handsome person like you should be very friendly. What did you just say? The little boy's eyes lit up. Hellion Vivian said slowly, should be very friendly.
No.
The first sentence. The little boy's face was serious. Hellion Vivian's mouth twitched again. I thought that a handsome person like you. Good taste. The little boy took out the small mirror that he always carried with him and looked at his face. It's very tiring to be woken up by my own handsomeness every day. Hellion Vivian chuckled. You're really too much a little boy. You haven't even grown hair yet. How can you talk about being handsome? Why do you think Little Hook doesn't like such a handsome second-generation yen like me? The little boy squatted down and began to pluck the dog's hair. His face was full of sadness. He couldn't be more dispirited. The two-headed dog was already crying because of his abuse. It was angry but didn't dare to say anything. Its eyes were filled with tears. They were really in pain. Hellion Vivian asked, Who is Little Hook? Which flower girl made him miss her so much? My good brother. When the little boy talked about his beloved, his face was full of smiles. He's also a human. Hellion Vivian's forehead twitched. So the person you like is a boy. Chapter 558. How can you fall in love with someone of a different gender? The little boy said confidently, he just doesn't want to face his own feelings. Sigh, he's really a troublesome little demon. Hellion Vivian. I think you're the one who's annoying.
How old are you? How old are you? How old are you?
Feelings? Who is it that has such a strong ability to resist pressure and not be scared away by you? Well, since you have such good taste, I'll make things easy for you. The little boy pointed at the two-headed dog that was still breathing and said, If you can defeat Big Dog and Second Dog, I'll pretend that I didn't see you today and send you back to the human world. If you lose, you can just stay here. If you can't even defeat Big Dog and Second Dog, you won't be able to deal with that person up there. You'll just die if you go back. I'll have to receive you again. Hellion Vivian calmed down and said faintly, Okay, then let's start. The little boy's smile was evil no matter how one looked at it. When the two-headed hellhound heard that it could eat people, it became energetic again. It raised its big claws and scratched at Hellion Vivian. Hellion Vivian's eyes narrowed, and her whole body stood upright in the air. The breeze formed an invisible airflow around her. However, such a barrier was nothing to the two-headed hellhound. It opened its mouth, and a raging fire rushed straight to the bone. Hellion Vivian's figure flashed, and a layer of light appeared in her eyes. She began to use the wind to rotate back and forth between the left and right sides. Her movements were so fast that even her shadow couldn't be seen, let alone attack. Left. Right. The two dog heads rushed to the left and right based on their instincts. In the end, they ran with all their might, causing them to feel pain in their balls. The tearing sensation made the two-headed hellhound cry out in pain. The two heads collided with each other and fell to the ground dizzily. How could they be convinced? They scratched their claws and prepared to attack again. Don't you feel ashamed? The little boy raised his axe and reached out to hold their heads. His eyes looked at Hellion Vivian again. You're quite smart. You know how to take advantage of the weaknesses of Big Hound and Second Hound. Hellion Vivian retracted her martial chi. I also have a dog. No matter how big a canine is, it's a little silly by nature. In her opinion, this two-headed dog was like a husky, extremely silly. Since you've won, I'll keep my promise and send you up. The little boy smiled evilly. However, it's really hard to say whether you can return to your own body. As long as the formation was not destroyed, even if you went up, as long as your soul did not return at midnight, your physical body would be taken over by others. This was not the worst thing. The worst thing was that if you did not return, you would be completely roasted by the time the sun rose, and you would never be able to reincarnate. Why, do you still want to go up? Hellion Vivian smiled. Of course, there are still people waiting for me up there. Are you sure that the people waiting for you are really waiting for you? The little boy said ambiguously. Then, he pulled the two-headed hellhound to the side and slightly lifted his chin to point at the passage that looked like a fireplace. You can go down from here and return to the human world. Hellion Vivian narrowed her eyes and called out, Yuan Ming. Yuan Ming lowered his voice. There's no problem. It really leads to the human world. This child is the son of the King of Hell. He's in charge of the 3 halls of hell. He's temperamental, but he's trustworthy. He won't deceive people. Even his last words were good for you. If you go up, it's very likely that you won't be able to return to your body. You always say that even you can't see through Beligaju's ability. Hellion Vivian turned her head. This time, what do you think the probability of him discovering this formation is? Yuan Ming was stunned for a moment before he said, 70%. He really doesn't look like an ordinary human. No, it's at least 80%. Hellion Vivian lowered her eyes. Since we agreed to drink, he will definitely return to the palace early. When he can't find me, he will definitely think of something and follow the vine to find the melon, but Yuan Ming frowned. But what? The words that the little king of hell just said. Hellion Vivian's fingers stiffened for a moment until she felt cold. She slowly opened her mouth. He may not be waiting for me, boom. The flame in the center of the formation was burning more and more fiercely. Next to the flame, there was a large black carved wooden coffin. The person in the coffin was none other than the soulless Hellion Vivian. The man in white leaned over and looked at her. His slender fingers tucked her messy hair behind her ear. His jade-like face had a doting smile. Soon, you will wake up for real. Master, Yun Biluo, with her long hair fluttering in the wind, walked over. Today, she was different from usual. Instead of wearing those delicate colors, she picked up a beautiful red dress that was quite queen-like. The man in white glanced at her. His finger slid across Hellion Vivian's facial features. He mumbled for a while, then bit his index finger and wrote a talisman with his blood. He then put it on Yun Biluo's body. Yun Biluo was shocked. Her whole face began to change. Her watery eyes became clear, her nose was taller than before, and the skin on her face became white and tender. She only lowered her eyes, but when she looked up again, she had completely changed her appearance. However, that wasn't the most shocking part. What made people feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts was that the face she transformed into was exactly the same as Vivian's. Go. There was a smile in the voice of the man in white. Haven't you always wanted to get Bailey Jiaju? Then think of all the tricks you have. At the very least, you have to make him stay quiet today and not come to make trouble. Yun Biluo looked at her own face in the river and turned around, saying, But if I were to use Hellion Wei Wei's face, I just feel this is the fastest way for you to get him. The man in white looked at her. Now that things have come to this, you should know better than anyone else that he won't look at any other woman except for Hellion Vivian. The past that you mentioned is completely useless. If you want to slowly penetrate his heart, you can only use this face. Don't worry, as long as you can stay calm tonight, from now on he will only like you. Does it matter whose face you use? After listening to the man's words, Yun Biluo bit her thin lips lightly. She seemed to have made up her mind. Her lips curved into a gloomy smile. It doesn't matter at all. If it wasn't for Hellion Vivian's face, His Highness won't even look at that wandering soul from God knows where. Since she can be pampered by that person with this face, so can I. Chapter 559. At night, layers of thick fog rose. The moonlight hidden in the shade of the trees seemed to be tinged with the color of blood. It was gloomy and made people feel uncomfortable. In the Chaoyong sleeping hall, the palace maids lit the lanterns and stood respectfully on both sides. There was only one luminous pearl in the hall, and the light was much dimmer than usual. The change in the palace this time seemed to have cleansed the entire palace. The emperor looked at the memorials presented to him and narrowed his eyes. He couldn't suppress the anger in his heart and reached out to throw the memorials at Eunuch Gao's face. Eunuch Gao was in pain, but didn't dare to cry out. He could only lower his head and bend over to pick them up. When he saw the words on the memorials, he turned his eyes and silently retreated to the side. This third prince, he is really looking down on me more and more. Even my subordinates were taken advantage of because of old Wu's confession this time. The emperor took a deep breath and looked at the pill in his hand with his dark eyes. He lowered his head and seemed to be muttering to himself, "Looks like I have to move that place too. I can't let him find out." Everyone said that the situation in the imperial court could change in an instant. Once again, the group of officials witnessed Bailey Jiaju's iron fist. At first, it was just a small chanting of sutras by a senior monk. Who would have thought that so many officials would be involved in it? Even the people from the Elder Compound could not escape this calamity. "Your Highness, what about the chanting monks?" Aning knelt on the ground and asked. They couldn't all be locked up in the palace, right? If it was according to his usual habits, Beligaju would have killed them long ago. At this moment, he inexplicably thought of that pair of worried eyes. His fingers paused and said, "Exile them. The farther the better."
Yes.
As Aning lowered his eyes, the minister of the Ministry of Personnel who was standing behind him also heaved a sigh of relief. He was really afraid that His Highness would casually kill them. These monks shouldn't have entered the palace with ulterior motives, but killing so many monks at once, wouldn't that be a sin? Fortunately, His Highness dealt with it more normally this time. Beligaju slowly brushed his sleeves and said in a clear and indifferent voice, "Minister Li, is there anything else?" "No, no more." He originally wanted to plead for those eminent monks, but he didn't expect it to go so smoothly. Beligaju closed the evidence in his hand about Elder Wu colluding with the Imperial Guards and stood up. "Since there is nothing else, let's investigate the river in the palace. It is not the rainy season recently. How did the river in the palace rise? Minister Li, haven't you thought about it?" Recently, Minister Li had been troubled by these strange cases in the palace. He had no clue at all. He didn't even have any idea how the deceased died. If it was just one or two people, it would be fine. No one would have thought that in just a few days, so many palace maids would die in the palace. Moreover, all of them had been drained of blood by some unknown method. Now, all the palace maids in the palace were trembling with fear. They were even a little absent-minded when doing things. If such a case had happened outside the palace, he would have had more time to investigate. However, it happened in the Imperial Palace, which was originally the safest place in the entire War Dragon Empire, yet such a thing actually happened. This was simply looking down on the Imperial Majesty. As the Minister of Official Personnel Affairs who was in charge of investigating the case, one could imagine how tormented he was in his heart. Now that he was reminded by the royal family, he finally understood. That's right, that river. How did that river appear? If it wasn't for that river, the dead bodies of the palace maids wouldn't have been discovered so late. This was definitely not a coincidence. There was no such thing as a coincidence in the world. The Minister of Official Personnel Affairs looked up again with an eager expression on his face. "Your Highness's thoughts are still alive. Why didn't this old official think of it?" "Because you are stupid." The light in Bailey Jiaju's eyes was indifferent as he threw down these 4 words. Then he strode out with his long legs and walked out. The Minister of Official Personnel Affairs looked back at Shadow. Was he being looked down upon by His Highness? Shadow raised his head and looked at the ceiling, pretending that he didn't understand the look in Minister Li's eyes. Today, Beligaju dealt with political affairs more gently than usual. He handed over the small fries to Minister Li and returned to the Jochong Palace when it was almost time. Many people who were scared to death heaved a sigh of relief. Your Highness, when the servants in the Jochong Palace saw Beligaju coming in, they quickly came forward to serve him. Beligaju reached out and unbuttoned the collar of his outer robe. His handsome face was slightly tilted, and the lines on his face were distinct. Where is the Princess Consort? The Princess Consort is taking a bath, the servant replied respectfully and reached out to take Beligaju's outer robe. Beligaju raised the corner of his mouth. Taking a bath? Someone wanted to take the initiative to send herself into his mouth. Go warm a pot of wine and bring it over. Bailey Jiaju instructed in a low and deep voice. His entire body was leaning on the carved wooden chair, and he casually picked up an ancient book. The servant answered, yes. Then he left. Usually, when the Princess Consort was present, His Highness didn't want them to stay in the bedroom. This time was no exception. The other eunuchs were also discerning, so they bowed their heads and left. Beligaju was the only one left in the huge hall. He flipped through the scroll in his hand casually. He was wearing an ancient nightgown that hung down to his ankles. The aura of asceticism was unmistakable. His face that could captivate all living things was like the Qinghua under the moonlight. Unlike the indifference in front of others, he now had a touch of soul-stirring laziness. When Yun Biluo, who was disguised as Hellion Vivian, walked in and saw this scene, she only felt her heart stop for a moment and her breathing became a little irregular. Among all the men in the world, only this person was so handsome that all women couldn't resist. Yun Biluo calmed her breathing and softened her voice. Your Highness. Beligaju raised his eyes and looked at her. His eyes were as deep as an ancient pool, giving people an unfathomable indifference. But now, this indifference showed signs of warmth. Yun Biluo saw it clearly, and because it was so clear, jealousy welled up in her heart. Why? Why was that woman from who knows where able to get special treatment from him? She was the one who was by his side when he was young. No one knew what he needed better than her. Yun Biluo clenched her hands that were hidden under the long sleeves. After all, it was because of this face. If that soul had not taken over Hellion Vivian's body, it wouldn't have attracted His Highness's interest. Now that she also had Hellion Vivian's face, she believed that His Highness would give her his unique love very soon. Thinking of this, Yun Biluo smiled. She was not stupid. She more or less knew that woman's character. She was usually arrogant and would not be close to His Highness. So, she followed Hellion Vivian's posture and walked toward Beligaju. Your Highness, have you finished your business? Chapter 560. Hearing this, Bailey Jiaju carelessly put down the ancient scroll in his hand. His long black hair casually draped over his shoulders, matching his angular face. He glanced at her again, his voice faintly humming. His slender legs were crossed, his pitch-black hair no longer had the alienation in front of others. As usual, he unhurriedly ordered, "Come here." Yun Biluo was secretly delighted, but she did not show it on her face. She pretended to be cold and indifferent as she moved closer. Her body tilted, and just as she was about to snuggle into Beligaju's arms, the atmosphere was disrupted by the servant who walked in. Your Highness. The servant held a wooden tray with both hands. On the tray was a pot of warm green bamboo leaf wine and 2 porcelain white wine glasses, the wine you want. Beligaju took one of the wine glasses and played with it in his hand. Even his fingertips seemed to be glowing. His arrogant and bewitching handsome face became extraordinarily charming at this moment, especially when he casually supported his head with one hand and swirled the wine glass with the other. He was as flamboyant as an ancient god. His long and narrow eyes looked at the person opposite him with a faint smile. Yun Biluo was full of thoughts. Seeing that there were 2 wine glasses, she could roughly guess what was going on. She immediately went to get the other wine glass. The servant put down the tray respectfully and retreated. Yun Biluo saw that there was finally no obstacle. Her legs gave way, and she wanted to repeat the same trick. However, she did not expect the man to stand up at this moment without warning, causing her to fall to the ground in an awkward position. "Your Highness?" Yun Biluo raised her eyes in confusion. Her heart was beating fast. Did he recognize her? Beligaju looked at her from above for a while, then slowly reached out his hand. His long and narrow eyes were as beautiful as the stars in the sky. "Why are you so stupid?" He did not recognize her. Yun Biluo could not help but feel relieved. She was about to put her hand in his palm. However, she saw that he avoided her touch. The strands of hair in front of his forehead moved slightly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became elegant and bloodthirsty at that moment. It was like the datura flower that bloomed beside the Wangchuan River. It was full of indescribable evil, innate coldness, and an invisible murderous aura. Seeing someone do such a stupid thing with his face really makes me want to vomit. Yun Biluo's eyes shook. She could not help but take a step back. "Your Highness, where is she?" He looked down at her coldly. His fangs were slightly exposed, and he was as handsome as a god. His black robe wrapped around his slender figure, revealing a cold, murderous aura. The surrounding wind suddenly, and it hurt when it blew on her face. Yun Biluo and Yun Biluo.
He was.
And he was always elegant and lofty. A simple raise of his eyebrows was enough to make all the spirit beasts tremble. In fact, when he was enraged, everything around him would not have a good ending. Yun Biluo felt the fear buried deep in her body. Her voice was dry and unnatural. "Your Highness, what are you talking about?"
"I don't understand anything."
She was in denial as she stepped back. She deceived herself by thinking that maybe he was just testing her. "You don't understand?" Bailey Jiaju took off the white gloves on his hands and bent down in a demonic manner. To him, the darkness was like daytime. His eyes, which were originally midnight, now seemed to have a faint demonic red. "Do you want me to break one of your ribs before you can understand what I'm asking?" Yun Biluo looked at the pair of eyes that were filled with evil. She was reminded of the time when he killed people with a smile on his face during the fire. In an instant, her scalp went numb. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" She was careful enough. Even the way she walked and talked was like that of Hellion Vivian. Beligaju pinched her neck and laughed coldly. "You don't need to understand."
"Where is she?"
Your Highness, cough cough. We both know that you're just treating her as a substitute of Hellion Vivian. She's not the real Hellion Vivian. If she doesn't leave, Hellion Vivian won't come back. Is it because the real Hellion Vivian doesn't like you that you stopped the eminent monks from using the soul-sucking spell? Yun Biluo's face was getting paler and paler. She used all her strength to finish her words. She was still resentful of that person's good luck. However, Beligaju did not even answer. He tightened his grip on her neck, as if he really wanted to kill her. "I'll ask you one more time. Where is she?" Yun Biluo was out of breath. She tiptoed and stared at him. "Your Highness, she's just a shadow. If you want to get Hellion Vivian, you can ask the real Hellion Vivian to come back." "Don't you understand what I'm saying?" Beligaju lifted her up with one hand. Someone dared to touch the prey he had set his eyes on right under his nose. Compared to the raging waves of anger, countless panic surged from the bottom of his heart. He did not like the image he imagined. Whenever he thought of the person who buried her head in picking out snacks for him, who would throw a towel to him after bathing, who would lie on his lap and let him wipe her hair for her, who would go to the hidden spirit temple without a word and cow down 9,990 times in order to reduce the sins on his body, who would never come back. He couldn't wait to kill someone. She even asked him what was wrong. That person was the only one. Even if he approached her with blood all over his body, she would not be afraid or hide. Instead, she would be so stunned that she would ask him where he was hurt. Why did these people have to take away the only thing that belonged to him? Unforgivable. In just a breath, it was as if something was completely broken. Fingernails as sharp as knives extended from the originally fair and slender fingers. Beligaju pinched his fingers into Yun Biluo's heart. Blood dripped down one drop after another. Yun Biluo widened her eyes and looked at the pair of eyes that had lost all humanity in disbelief. Yu. The pain in his chest had worn out all his patience. Beligaju pushed the dying Yun Biluo aside and put his index finger in front of his lips to make a shushing gesture. His bright red thin lips and pale skin made him emit a desperate and forbidden evil aura. Then, he stood up and straightened his proud back. A noble and arrogant aura suddenly rose. A corner of his long black cloak was lifted by the fierce wind. He stood up straight and wiped the blood off his finger in disgust. His figure flashed, and like a black fog, he quickly walked in the thick night sky. Everywhere he went, there would definitely be the smell of blood. Chapter 561. Beside the river, the 7 stars aligned like pearls. Hellion Vivian, who was sleeping in a wooden coffin, did not react at all. Her red ancient robe made her oval face look even more delicate and delicate. The man in white who was looking at her suddenly bent his finger. The corner of his mouth curled up, and there was a hint of coldness in his voice. "You're really useless. You can't even deal with Beligaju." "Master, do you need me to help?" A small person with a gourd on his head walked over. There was a huge skeleton tied to his back. His small body did not seem to be affected by the weight of the skeleton. His posture was very standard. The man in white had a cold expression on his face. He coughed a few times. "No need. You have to stay here and watch over the fire of resentment. Don't let it extinguish. There are twin resentful spirits outside. No matter how powerful Beligaju is, he's just a mortal. If the most powerful resentful spirits of the demon world work together, he can only step into the Yellow Springs. Outside the barrier, a black figure quickly jumped over the wall. The fog-like figure appeared in the corridors of the various palaces from time to time. Many of the eunuchs on night duty thought that their eyes were playing tricks on them. They rubbed their eyes with all their might. When they stopped to take a look, there was indeed a man with long black hair in front of him. He was wearing a long cloak. His black eyes were faintly glowing as he looked at the cold palace not far away. His entire body was emitting a cold aura. But in the blink of an eye, there was nothing in front of them. There was only the boundless night sky. The eunuchs could not help but mutter in their hearts that they had seen a ghost. The hair on their bodies stood up. At this moment, Bailey Jiaju was no longer concerned about the impact his actions would have on the imperial palace. His dark pupils contracted as he stared at the wizardry barrier in front of him with a gloomy gaze. He then took a step toward the river. Ding. The crisp sound of a metal bell was like a small circle of ripples on the surface of the water suddenly being hit by raindrops. It suddenly spread in the air like a group of cold ghosts. Haha. A tender voice with an indescribable sense of strangeness came from the source of the darkness. "I didn't expect to be found so quickly." In the boundless night, 2 little boys appeared. They wore green shirts and red pants. Their faces were numb and empty. Their faint voice was like a pool of stagnant black water. "Not a bad soul. What a pity. Young master told us not to eat humans. Otherwise, it would be good to use you as nourishment." "It doesn't matter. As long as we can kill him, we can slowly enjoy him. Although I prefer drinking a woman's blood to a man's, this man looks very tasty." The boy turned his head. His mouth was hollow and black, as if he wasn't the one who said those words. It was so eerie that it was suffocating Beligaju's side handsome face. The bottom of his eyes condensed into ice. "Get out of the way." These 2 words made the boy named Ming Yuan's reddened eyes turn. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the copper bell let out a crisp and long sound. The sound was very long, as if it was the sound of a soul being summoned from hell. Darkness shrouded the top of his head, and a constantly rising chill circulated in the surroundings. It transformed into snakes one after another, all of them biting towards Beligaju. Beligaju quickly got up. His black robe fluttered in the air at a dazzling speed. However, In the eyes of the resentful baby demon, those movements were simply clumsy. TSK, foolish human. You overestimate yourself. Wake up, you're no match for us at all.
Whoosh.
More snakes poured out of the nest, spitting out their scarlet tongues as they ruthlessly bit the back of Beligaju's hand. His thick black eyebrows furrowed, and his movements stiffened for a moment. However, he didn't stop his footsteps and continued to walk into the depths of the barrier. His black robe fluttered, and blood flowed down his fingertips, dripping onto the ground drop by drop. It was a bright but heart-wrenching red. The resentful spirit sneered, "You can actually still walk? But this is the end. Devour him."
Whoosh.
Another wave of black snakes moved out, but this time, they broke out of the ground around Beligage's body. With a fast, sharp, and arrogant manner, they coiled around his body bit by bit, binding him up in circles. Then, they gradually tightened, densely biting his muscles, and injected extreme cold into his body like venom. It pressed on his heart as if it was suffocating, and blood gushed out of his mouth. Heh, what a beautiful scene. The resentful spirit laughed. Even the blood is fresh. What do you think, Yuan? The resentful spirit laughed hoarsely, each time strangely. Right now, I just want to taste what he tastes like with my own mouth. It's time to end all of this. The resentful spirit's eyes were red, and its black mouth was open, indescribably terrifying. But what was even more frightening was that the black snakes that coiled around Beligaju seemed to have gone crazy. They coiled around his body densely until his whole body was wrapped around the ground. His original appearance could not be seen, but those black snakes did not stop. Okay, be gentle. Don't eat all of him. Leave some for me and Yuan. Before the boy finished his words, there was a crashing sound. Out of nowhere, large clumps of black feathers clustered together, and giant birds flew out. Black fog filled the air, as if something was quietly waking up. Yuan, listen, what is that sound? The resentful spirit, who was relatively larger, turned around and asked his younger brother. Yuan did not have time to listen, because when this sound rang out, he felt as if there was something deep in his blood that was about to be stirred up, and even his body was strange. Pung, pung, pung. As if affected by an unknown magnetic field, there was a huge vibration in his chest. He looked up with a pale face, and there was a faint blue light in his eyes. He was even affected to the point that his whole body was uncomfortable. Brother, there is someone there? The resentful spirit reached out and hugged him, and his expression became dignified. Except for a human who is not afraid of death, there is no one. But why, oh why? Yuan's throat overflowed with a fishy sweetness, and blood kept flowing out from the corner of his mouth. But he did not seem to see it, and his eyes were blocked. I can feel that person's breath. That person? Compared to his younger brother, the elder brother's magic was weaker, so he naturally did not know anything. Except for the discomfort in his heart, he did not feel anything. Who is that person? Yuan slowly closed his eyes and leaned on the sand tiredly. His thin lips were pale, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. Our most honorable king. Chapter 562. Following the boy's words, there was a loud bang. The black snake that was wrapped around Beligage's body was blasted into pieces by an unknown force. In the midst of the bloody mist, the sound of footsteps could be heard. The two wraiths froze in their actions and slowly turned their heads. They only saw the black boots rhythmically tapping on the ground. The wind blew from all directions, fluttering Beligaju's black robes. He just stood there, aloof and cold, with an evil aura, filling the air with thick black smoke. The wraiths looked at him, their brown eyes slowly widening, as if they had seen something inconceivable. Their faces were filled with intense astonishment. They opened their pale, thin lips, wanting to speak, but found that their throat was so dry that they couldn't make a sound. She could only watch helplessly as Bailey Jiaju walked closer and closer, closer and closer. Time seemed to have stopped. Beligaju's footsteps stopped in front of the two wraiths. From this angle, his slender legs looked even more straight and powerful. The side of his angular face was as pale as crystal and was extremely evil. Compared to his cold and indifferent self, there was an indescribable feeling. Your Highness. The wraiths' faces suddenly changed. They reached out to grab the clothes in front of their chests and painfully lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Beligaju reached out and picked up one of the wraiths. The corners of his mouth were filled with an evil aura. This Highness will give you one last chance. Come, tell me, where did you put her? In the middle of the river. The boy's originally pale face now looked even more purple. The other wraiths trembled all over, afraid that Beligaju would hurt their brother. They raised their small face and said, Your Highness, it's not our fault.
We just made a contract with someone.
We didn't expect that person to be your prey. Who are you calling Your Highness? When Beligaju lowered his eyes, the demonic red in his eyes flashed. Then he raised his left hand and threw the wraith's back. Amidst the sounds of the wraiths around him, he resumed his lazy, evil smile. His body was covered in blood. Even his face was stained with spots of red. At this moment, he looked like an overlord who controlled the darkness. He was not as indifferent as before, but was shockingly handsome. The two wraiths stood in a row, not daring to speak again. They only watched the man walk into the depths of the night. He was obviously the evilest demon in the world, but he was tired of the superior attitude of a god. He had an incomparably holy face, and his movements were filled with ascetic elegance, deceiving all the people of the world. Whether it was demons or demons, they were filled with innate worship of him. This man had once stood outside the 9 heavens, illuminated by the light of Buddha, and worshipped by thousands of demons. Buddha asked him what he wanted to do. He said, I want the sky can no longer cover my eyes. I want this land to be unable to bury my heart. I want all living beings to understand. I want all the Buddhas to vanish. That's right. That's their king. But why did the king look like he didn't recognize them? Also, didn't the king disappear? How did he become human? Moreover, they could clearly sense an uncertain demonic aura from him. What was going on? The two wraiths looked at each other, their eyes filled with deep doubts. After that great battle, the descendants of the exorcists used their own flesh and blood to cast a seal. They escaped because of the resentment in the hearts of the people. The king's soul was split into pieces and fell into the human world, but his body disappeared forever. No one knew where he went. Both humans and demons thought that he had died long ago. Could it be that that person planned to come back from the beginning? In a way that no one could have imagined, he was reborn. Creak, along with Bailey Jiaju's pacing. The fog that pervaded the night was like a broken glass, cracking with streaks of cracks. Vaguely, a deep flight of stairs appeared in the middle of the river. There were torches around the stairs, burning with blue flames. The little one guarding the fire of resentment paused. His round eyes widened in disbelief. His pupils flickered back and forth. Master, is this his aura? The demon-transforming beast was not as stable as the little one. The unknown pressure made its blood boil. Its claws seemed to have lost control of themselves and were trembling in fear. It could no longer stand up straight. It was as if someone was ordering it to kneel. The man in white raised his eyes. There was a trace of surprise in the corner of his eyes. In the rippling water, his dark eyes were as deep as an ancient well. He was gentle and elegant, but extremely dangerous. He's still alive. After saying that, the man turned his head and looked at the little one. How about the time? How much longer? Very soon, the little one threw another wraiths into the torch. The flame burned brighter and brighter. It slowly spread around the coffin and enveloped Hellion Vivian. The man smiled. He bit his finger and fed the blood into Hellion Vivian's mouth. His eyes were full of love. Even if that person appears now, it won't change anything. You can't replace the Phoenix Girl. Go back to where you belong as soon as possible, Hellion Vivian.
Boom.
The blue flames burned. After returning from hell, Hellion Wei Wei finally felt something, but it was as painful as burning her skin. She could not integrate into the body at all, and the feeling of being burned to ashes made her feel as if she was in the blazing flames of hell. It was unbearable. She watched as another Hellion Vivian walked out of the lake and approached the body step by step. However, she did not even have the strength to move. Other than the figure in front of her, there was only a sea of fire. Her soul seemed to have lost consciousness. She did not know where it had drifted to. It was said that people would see the silhouettes of their previous lives before they died. However, what she saw was the little boy who stood alone in the 9 layers of the palace. He was abused by the palace servants until he could only eat coarse food. Even his mother, who was incomparably dignified in front of others, was no longer favored and treated him as a punching bag. She called him to her side and stabbed him with silver needles one by one. Cold blood flowed out from his fingers. He just leaned against the wooden door. His long hair was as dark as night and draped over his back. It made him look like a dejected elf. He lowered his eyes. There was a faint smile in his self-deprecating tone. How stupid. You know what the result is, but you're still so naive. As he spoke, the boy's black hair surged and covered his blood-red eyes. She stood in front of him. In the end, she could not help but feel sorry for him. She wanted to reach out and hug him. However, she strangely found that she went through his body. Chapter 563. With no other choice, Hellion Vivian could only helplessly sit with him on the steps. It was winter, and the snow was especially heavy in the capital. But he didn't move at all. His porcelain-like, delicate little face had an unusual coldness. She didn't know if it was because too much time had passed, but it was so long that even Hellion Vivian felt that her hands and feet were cold. Only then did the boy suddenly raise his eyes. Hellion Vivian thought that he had finally seen her and was about to open her mouth to speak. But she saw him look past her face and set his eyes on a delicately dressed little girl. That little girl was very beautiful and looked to be of noble birth. She wore a double-button long skirt and a pink fur cloak. She was currently hugging a pile of food and looking at him as if she was very scared. She quickly put down the things in her hands and ran away. She could faintly hear her say, "That third prince is so scary. Brother Chongfeng, wait for me." Scary? The boy lowered his eyes and looked at his palm, as if he had heard a funny joke. He laughed deeply, with a kind of evil aura that made one's heart ache. If Hellion Vivian didn't see wrong, that little girl should be the original body in her memory when it was young. She was very kind, and when she looked at the boy, she was full of pity. Could it be, because of this, that Beligaju treated this body differently from the previous owner of this body? Hellion Vivian stood in place, her body a bit stiff. In fact, she had always felt guilty in her heart. She shouldn't have taken this body. But Yuan Ming had already told her that if she hadn't entered this body, it would have been dead. Yuan Ming's meaning was very simple. That was to say, if she hadn't transmigrated, the previous Hellion Vivian would very likely have died in that river. She wouldn't have casually brought a dead soul with her. That was why her guilt wasn't so obvious. But Hellion Vivian turned her head, and her eyes moved slightly. Did His Highness want her, or did he want this body's previous owner? Hellion Vivian's originally firm heart loosened in an instant. She wasn't good at relationships. When they were together, they would do things based on secret manuals. In any case, there was only one thought in her mind. I definitely can't let someone suffer. But was this what a normal man would want? Hellion Vivian was a little uncertain. She had always been a woman. She had also passed the age of innocence, so she naturally did not have any pity in her heart. She liked to be overcautious, but she couldn't learn to be innocent, just like that little girl. Since you're afraid, then don't get close. Didn't they know that the cat like His Highness was actually very sensitive? Just by looking at the way he usually looked at others, it was as if he was a high and mighty emperor. One could tell how proud he was. What was there to be afraid of? Hellion Vivian admitted that she was a little angry. She didn't know if she was angry at the little girl's words or Beligaju's attitude. Her legs began to feel weak again, as if her entire body had been soaked in water. It should have been very comfortable, but because of the color of the water, she felt a little depressed. Everywhere was a dark red that made one's hair stand on end. The river didn't seem like water, but more like someone's blood. The row of palace maids that Helly and Vivian saw before appeared again. Their faces were still expressionless, as rigid as wooden puppets. When the iron chains under their feet entered the water, it made a dull sound, but they walked forward numbly as if they didn't hear it, until the river water flooded over their heads, leaving only black hair floating on the surface of the river. That kind of scene was very scary, but Helly and Vivian was getting closer and closer to them. The black hair seemed to be pulled by something in the water, moving towards Helly and Vivian, as if it wanted to swallow her up. Helly and Vivian wanted to avoid it, but found that her four limbs didn't listen to her at all. Her hands and feet seemed to be controlled by someone. Her thoughts were clear, but she couldn't move as she pleased. Instead, she leaned to the side and directly faced the black hair. Helly and Vivian narrowed her eyes, used all her strength, raised her arm, and slashed in the direction of the black hair. The black hair didn't expect that she still had room to fight back. After pausing in place, it became even crazier. Helly and Vivian bit her thin lips. Large beads of sweat overflowed from her forehead. Her face was so pale that it seemed to have lost all color, but this didn't stop her from wanting to slash a second time. Swish! The thin silver knife was shockingly sharp, and it stabbed the center of the black hair in an instant. The black hair finally stopped, like a dense mass of algae floating on the surface of the river, motionless. However, something even scarier came. Helly and Wei Wei had just turned her head when she saw a face. She couldn't be more familiar with that face, but because it was too close, no matter how she looked at it, it made her feel terrified. I didn't expect you to be so stubborn. Even resentment can't do anything to you. You should have returned my body long ago. Why do you keep occupying my things? The mouth of the face moved again and again, using a pair of empty eyes to look at Helly and Vivian. Helly and Vivian smiled. No matter how tired she was, it couldn't hide her prodigal strength. You should have drowned long ago. Why don't you die? You? The face seemed to be angered, looking at Helly and Vivian. It thought of something and smiled lightly. I know, you don't want to leave. It's all because of the third prince. But you also saw, if it wasn't for me, the third prince wouldn't have treated you differently at all. Don't tell me. Even now, you still don't understand who the third prince is obsessed with? Helly and Vivian tightened the silver knife in her hand, her eyes cold. This kind of question, it's better to ask clearly in person. As for whether he treats me differently because of you, when I go back, I'll naturally know the answer. Do you think I'll believe whatever you say? Are you insulting my intelligence? You know better than anyone how worried the third prince is about this body. I don't need to say this, right? The face laughed, as if it was mocking her. He's even more worried about this body than he is about you. Thinking about it, it's only a substitute, so he won't pay too much attention to it. But no matter how much you struggle, it's useless. Once the seal is broken, the demons will run rampant. I have to go back. Helly and Vivian listened to her words, only to feel a sudden pain in her back. When she looked back, she found out that the black hair didn't die at all. Instead, it was boiling, directly penetrating her ribs, entangling her inch by inch, pulling her whole body into the endless deep water. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.